He was born on the 25th of June 1900 at Frogmore House on the Windsor estate. Queen Victoria, who had been the dominant institutional figure of British royal life across the previous 6 decades, was substantially present at the family gatherings that surrounded the birth. She would die 7 months later, on the 22nd of January 1901. The infant who had just been born would be, by the institutional coincidence that had organized the timing of his arrival, the last of Queen Victoria's godchildren, the figure whose institutional position had been substantially defined by the cumulative weight of being connected to the previous reigning monarch, in the most institutionally direct way the framework's traditional logic permitted. He was named Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas. He was called Dickie by the family from his earliest weeks. The family of Battenberg, the German princely family from which his father came, had not yet at the time of his birth anglicized its name to Mountbatten. The change would come in 1917, when the cumulative pressures of British wartime anti-German sentiment would substantially require the various German-named relatives of the British royal family to adopt English versions of their names. Louis of Battenberg would, at age 17, become Louis Mountbatten. The cumulative institutional transition would shape every dimension of his subsequent decades. He would live across the next 79 years inside the substantial institutional position that his birth had organized. He would become, across the cumulative period, the figure whose institutional manipulation of the British royal family had been substantially documented across multiple authoritative biographical examinations of his life. He would engineer the marriage of his nephew Philip to the future Queen Elizabeth II. He would preside as the last Viceroy of India over the catastrophic partition that produced the deaths of approximately 1 to 2 million people across the religious violence of August and September 1947. He would substantially manipulate the institutional dynamics of the British royal family across the cumulative decades that followed. He would mentor the future King Charles III as his honorary grandfather across the cumulative period of Charles's formation. He would, on the 27th of August 1979, be assassinated by the Provisional Irish Republican Army when a remotely detonated bomb destroyed his fishing boat off the coast of Mullaghmore in County Sligo, Ireland. This documentary is about the cumulative pattern of his institutional behavior across the 79 years. The pattern has been substantially documented across the cumulative biographical record. The most substantial single source has been Andrew Lowney's 2019 biography, The Mountbattens, Their Lives and Loves, which drew on 4 years of research, over 100 interviews, and substantial archival material that the cumulative Freedom of Information requests had substantially produced. The biography has been preserved across the cumulative reception as one of the most substantial documentary examinations of Mountbatten and his wife Edwina that the cumulative period has produced. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the cumulative biographical record has substantially preserved is the institutional pattern that the title of this documentary refers to. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister from 1955 to 1957, substantially characterized Mountbatten as a congenital liar. The naval historian Stephen Roskill, whose work on British naval history has been substantially authoritative across the cumulative period, warned that Mountbatten's testimony should never be relied on unless it was supported by independent evidence. Insiders across the cumulative decades of the senior royal family had substantially registered the institutional joke about how long any conversation with Mountbatten would last before he referenced "my niece the Queen." The cumulative documentary record has preserved the substantial features of the institutional figure he had been. The pattern includes specific dimensions. The first dimension is the vanity that has been substantially preserved as the most consistent single feature of his particular character across the cumulative biographical record. Lowney's framing was specific. His conceit masked a profound sense of inadequacy. The conceit had been the cumulative institutional surface. The inadequacy had been the cumulative private reality. Both had been operating across the cumulative 79 years. The second dimension is the manipulation. Mountbatten had been, by the cumulative documentary record, one of the most institutionally manipulative figures of his generation. He had manipulated the marriage of his nephew Philip. He had manipulated the institutional dynamics of the British royal family across the cumulative decades. He had manipulated his own historical record across the cumulative period through the substantial self-mythologization that defined his post-war institutional position. The manipulation had been substantial. The third dimension is the destruction. The cumulative pattern of how Mountbatten had treated figures who disappointed him had been substantially documented across the cumulative biographical record. He had destroyed naval subordinates whose performance had not matched his expectations. He had destroyed institutional rivals through the substantial mechanisms his royal connections had made available. He had attempted to destroy biographers who had not produced the laudatory accounts he had required. The cumulative pattern of destruction had been the institutional reality that the title of this documentary refers to. The royals who watched him operate across the cumulative period had registered what he was. This is the structural dimension of the documentary that the title's second clause refers to. Philip had watched, Edwina his wife had watched, his daughters Patricia and Pamela had watched, Queen Elizabeth had watched, Queen Mary, who had been substantially hostile to Mountbatten's institutional ambitions, had watched. The Queen Mother, who had been substantially hostile across the cumulative period, had watched. Charles, who had been substantially closer to Mountbatten than to his own father across the cumulative decades, had watched. Each of them had registered the cumulative pattern. Each of them had absorbed what Mountbatten's particular character had imposed on them across the cumulative period of their respective interactions with him. This documentary is about that cumulative pattern. The pattern is the pattern of a man whose substantial institutional position had been organized around his royal connection, but whose cumulative behavior had imposed substantial costs on the figures who had been required to operate inside his cumulative orbit. The cumulative costs have been preserved across the documentary record. The cumulative pattern is now part of the historical record that subsequent generations of biographers and historians will continue to engage with. What this documentary will examine, across its 8 parts, is the cumulative pattern in the specific dimensions the available evidence permits. The hook has substantially established the figure. The parts that follow will examine the cumulative dimensions. Both pictures of Mountbatten are real. The institutional figure, whose cumulative achievements have included substantial dimensions of British 20th century history, is real. The institutional figure, whose cumulative behavior has imposed substantial costs on the people who operated inside his orbit, is also real. Both have to be held together in any honest examination of his life. The historical record now contains both. This documentary will examine the cumulative pattern that the documentary record has substantially preserved. The family that produced Mountbatten had been, in its institutional reality, one of the most substantially connected families in the European royal network of the late 19th century. His father, Louis of Battenberg, had been born in 1854 at Schloss Graz in Austria, the morganatic son of Prince Alexander of Hesse and Julia von Hocke, a Polish countess whose marriage to Alexander had been the cumulative institutional event that had produced the Battenberg family line. The family had been, by the cumulative institutional reality of European royalty, the kind of secondary royal line whose institutional position had been substantially organized around the marriage networks that connected the various senior royal houses. Louis of Battenberg had joined the British Royal Navy in 1868 at the age of 14. He had pursued the kind of substantial naval career that the cumulative institutional opportunities of British royal connection had made available. He had married in 1884 Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria through her daughter Princess Alice. The marriage had been the institutional moment at which the Battenberg family line had been substantially inserted into the inner circle of the British royal family. Princess Victoria had been Queen Victoria's substantial favourite among her grandchildren. The cumulative institutional position that the marriage had produced had been substantial. The couple had produced 4 children across the cumulative period of their marriage. Princess Alice of Battenberg had been born in 1885. Princess Louise had been born in 1889. Prince George had been born in 1892. Prince Louis Francis, Dickie, had been born in 1900 as the 4th and final child. The age gap between Dickie and his eldest sister had been 15 years. The age gap had institutional consequences across the cumulative period of his childhood. He had been the substantially youngest member of a family whose institutional dynamics had already been substantially established by the time of his arrival. His position as the youngest child had specific institutional features. He had been substantially indulged across his earliest years. He had been the family's substantial favorite. He had been substantially produced into the kind of vain, ambitious, institutionally focused figure that the cumulative dynamics of his early position had been substantially organizing him to become. What had also been operating across the cumulative period of his early childhood was the substantial royal network in which the family had been substantially embedded. He had spent his earliest summers at Heiligenberg, the family estate in Germany. He had attended the wedding of King Edward VII's daughter Princess Maud to King Håkon VII of Norway in 1905. He had been substantially present at the various senior royal events that the cumulative period had produced. His earliest formation had been substantially organized around the cumulative reality of being inside the senior royal network at the moment of its substantial pre-First World War operation. The substantial event that would, across the cumulative period of his subsequent decades, define many dimensions of his particular character, had occurred in October 1914. His father, Louis of Battenberg, had been at the time the first Sea Lord of the British Royal Navy. He had been the institutional figure whose substantial responsibility had organized the cumulative naval operations of Britain across the early period of the First World War. He had been the figure whose German birth had been increasingly substantially registered across the cumulative weeks of the war as the kind of institutional liability that the British wartime conditions had been substantially producing demands for the removal of. The cumulative public pressure had reached the point at which Louis of Battenberg had been substantially required to resign. He resigned on the 29th of October 1914. The institutional resignation had been the substantial humiliation that the family had absorbed. The cumulative effect on the 14-year-old Dickie had been substantial. He had registered across the cumulative period that followed the institutional injustice of his father's removal. He had absorbed across his subsequent formation the cumulative determination to vindicate his father's reputation that the resignation had substantially produced. The cumulative vindication would become one of the foundational features of his particular character across the subsequent decades. He had been substantially organized, across his cumulative life, around the deliberate institutional ambition to substantially exceed his father's institutional achievements. He had pursued across the cumulative decades the substantial naval career that his father had been required to abandon. He had eventually achieved in 1955 the substantial position of First Sea Lord that his father had been required to resign 41 years earlier. The cumulative achievement had been the substantial institutional vindication that his particular character had been substantially organized to produce. The vindication had specific psychological consequences. The cumulative documentary record has preserved Loney's substantial framing of what the cumulative dynamics produced in Mountbatten's particular character. His conceit masked a profound sense of inadequacy. The framing had been substantial. The inadequacy had been the cumulative private reality that his father's institutional humiliation had substantially seeded. The conceit had been the cumulative institutional surface that his subsequent career had substantially constructed around the inadequacy. Both had been operating across the cumulative period of his subsequent decades. The cumulative obsession with genealogy that has been substantially documented across the biographical record had been one of the substantial manifestations of the underlying inadequacy. Mountbatten had been substantially fixated across the cumulative period of his life on the institutional details of his royal ancestry. He had been substantially preoccupied with the cumulative documentation of his family tree. He had been substantially organized across his cumulative life around the substantial institutional pursuit of confirming his royal legitimacy in dimensions that the cumulative period would not have substantially required. The most substantial single dimension of the obsession had been Mountbatten's continuing institutional discomfort with the cumulative fact that one of his ancestors had been born outside wedlock, specifically the morganatic origin of the Battenberg line through Julia von Hauke. The cumulative institutional discomfort had been substantial. Mountbatten had been substantially organized, across his cumulative life, around the substantial institutional pursuit of substantially elevating the Battenberg-Mountbatten line above the cumulative limitations that the morganatic origin had institutionally produced. What had also been operating across the cumulative period of his early formation was the substantial naval preparation that his particular character had been substantially organized around. He had been substantially trained across his cumulative adolescence for the substantial naval career that his father's earlier institutional position had been substantially preparing him for. He had attended the Royal Naval College at Osborne from 1913 to 1915, then the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth from 1915 to 1916. He had been commissioned as a midshipman in 1916. He had served across the final years of the First World War in various naval positions that the cumulative institutional opportunities had made available. What he had also been substantially absorbing across the cumulative period of his naval training was the substantial institutional culture that the British Royal Navy of the period had been substantially organized around. He had been substantially formed, across the cumulative period of his naval education, into the kind of officer whose particular institutional approach had been substantially organized around the substantial discipline that the framework had been substantially imposing on him. The institutional discipline had been substantial. The cumulative effect had been the substantial naval formation that his subsequent career would substantially draw on. The cumulative period of his early adulthood had been substantially organized around the cumulative continuation of his naval career and the substantial institutional preparation that his particular position had been substantially organizing. He had served on various ships across the cumulative period of the 1920s. He had pursued the substantial institutional opportunities that his cumulative royal connections had made substantially available. He had been substantially developing, across the cumulative period, the institutional figure that his subsequent decades would substantially confirm. What had also been operating, across the cumulative period of his early adulthood, was the substantial development of the various institutional features that the cumulative biographical record has substantially preserved. He had been developing his cumulative obsession with uniforms by Loney's framing, the substantial preoccupation that had been substantially organized around the cumulative institutional features that his royal position had substantially permitted. He had been developing his cumulative tendency towards self-mythologization that would, across the subsequent decades, substantially define his institutional approach to his own historical record. He had been developing the cumulative institutional ambition that would substantially organize his particular character across the cumulative period of his subsequent decades. The cumulative formation had been substantial. The cumulative formation had been substantially adequate to the demands that his subsequent positions would substantially impose on him. The cumulative formation had also been, however, substantially organized around the underlying inadequacy that his father's earlier institutional humiliation had substantially seeded. The cumulative tension between the institutional surface and the underlying inadequacy would, across the cumulative period of his subsequent decades, substantially define the figure he would become. By 1922, Mountbatten was 22 years old. He had completed the cumulative institutional formation that his particular position had substantially organized. He was now positioning himself for the substantial marriage that would, across the cumulative period that followed, substantially confirm his institutional position. The marriage would be to Edwina Ashley, one of the substantially wealthiest heiresses in Britain, whose family connections would substantially provide the institutional foundation that Mountbatten's particular ambition had been substantially organizing around. The marriage would be conducted as the substantial institutional event of the period, the wedding of the century, the substantial institutional language that the cumulative period would substantially apply to the moment. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, would serve as best man. The substantial institutional pageantry would be substantially organized around the cumulative public attention that the wedding had substantially produced. The cumulative wedding would substantially confirm Mountbatten's institutional position as one of the substantial figures of the period. What the cumulative wedding would also confirm, across the subsequent decades that the marriage would substantially extend across, was the substantial institutional reality that the public version of the marriage would substantially conceal. The reality would substantially diverge from the public manifestation. The reality would be substantially complicated. The reality would substantially produce the cumulative pattern of open marriage, affairs, mutual humiliation, and substantial cumulative complications that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. In the part that follows, we move to the marriage itself. The 1922 wedding at Westminster Abbey. Edwina Ashley, the substantially wealthy heiress whose institutional position would substantially organize Mountbatten's subsequent decades. The reality underneath the public version. The open marriage that would substantially define both partners across the cumulative period. The affairs that would substantially produce the cumulative documentary record. The mutual humiliation that would substantially characterize the cumulative dynamics. The framework that produced both partners. The cumulative reality that Edwina had been substantially absorbing across the cumulative early years of the marriage. The cumulative pattern that the marriage would substantially produce across the cumulative subsequent decades. She was born on the 28th of November 1901 at Broadlands, the substantial country estate in Hampshire that her family had been substantially occupying across the cumulative period of the previous decades. She was Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley. Her father was Wilfred Ashley, a conservative politician who would, across the cumulative period of his subsequent decades, become the first Baron Mount Temple. Her mother was Maud Cassell, the substantial figure whose own family background had been the foundational institutional reality that Edwina's particular position had been substantially organized around. The Cassell family was the substantial dimension of Edwina's background that her subsequent institutional position would substantially draw on. Edwina's grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassell, had been one of the most institutionally substantial financiers of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. He had been the substantial financial advisor to King Edward VII. He had been the substantial figure whose accumulated wealth had been substantially preserved across the cumulative period through the substantial financial networks that his particular position had been substantially organized around. His granddaughter Edwina had been by the cumulative inheritance that his death in 1921 had substantially produced, one of the substantially wealthiest young women in Britain. The wealth had specific institutional dimensions. Edwina had inherited by the cumulative effect of Cassell's will approximately £2.5 million, the equivalent of approximately £120 million in contemporary value. The cumulative inheritance had been substantial. The cumulative inheritance had substantially exceeded what any senior British royal of Mountbatten's generation had been substantially organised to inherit. The cumulative inheritance had been the substantial institutional reality that Mountbatten's particular ambition had been substantially registering when he began pursuing Edwina across the cumulative early period of their relationship. What Mountbatten had been bringing to the relationship had been institutionally different. He had been, by every available account from those who observed the period, substantially less financially independent than the institutional position of his royal connection had suggested. His naval salary had been approximately the equivalent of £17,000 annually in contemporary value. His private income had added another £17,000 approximately. The cumulative total had been substantial but not princely. The cumulative total had not been adequate to the substantial institutional lifestyle that Mountbatten's particular ambition had been substantially organizing around. The institutional differential between Mountbatten's substantial royal connection and his substantially limited personal wealth had been the substantial foundation of his approach to the marriage with Edwina. He had loved her by every available account from those who observed the early period of the relationship. He had also, by the cumulative documentary record that the biographical examinations have substantially preserved, loved her substantial fortune. The cumulative reality had been the substantial combination that the marriage had been substantially organized around. Loney's substantial framing has been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Mountbatten married her largely for her money. The framing was substantial. The framing had been the cumulative documentary conclusion that the substantial biographical research had substantially produced. The framing had also been substantially accompanied by Loney's substantial acknowledgement that despite being pecuniarily actuated, he and Edwina grew to love each other genuinely. Both dimensions had been operating. The substantial financial calculation had been the foundation. The substantial genuine affection had been the cumulative development that the cumulative subsequent years had substantially produced. The wedding was conducted on the 18th of July 1922 at St. Margaret's, Westminster. The institutional moment was substantial. The cumulative period had been substantially organized around the substantial public expectation that the wedding had been substantially producing. The cumulative public reception had been substantial. Souvenirs had been produced. A Pathé newsreel film had been made. Thousands of well-wishers had lined the streets of London. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII, had served as Mountbatten's best man. The cumulative event had been substantially preserved as one of the substantial society weddings of the period. The honeymoon had been substantial. The couple had travelled across Europe and to the United States across the cumulative months following the wedding. They had been entertained by various substantial figures of the period. They had been photographed at the various locations they had visited. The cumulative honeymoon had been the substantial institutional preview of the cumulative life that the marriage would substantially produce. Substantial wealth, substantial travel, substantial public attention, substantial connection to the most substantial institutional figures of the cumulative period. What had also been operating across the cumulative early period of the marriage was the substantial institutional reality that the public version of the relationship had been substantially organized to conceal. The reality had been substantial. The cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved the specific dimensions. The first dimension had been the substantial reality that both partners had been substantially organized around their own particular institutional priorities, rather than around the substantial mutual commitment that the public version had substantially implied. Mountbatten had been substantially organized around his cumulative naval career and his substantial institutional ambition. Edwina had been substantially organized around the cumulative social life that her substantial wealth had substantially permitted. The cumulative period of the early marriage had been substantially organized around the simultaneous pursuit of these two substantially different institutional priorities, rather than around the cumulative mutual partnership that the public version had been substantially organizing. The second dimension had been the substantial reality of the affairs. Both partners had been substantially involved, across the cumulative period of the early marriage, in romantic relationships outside the marriage. Mountbatten had been substantially involved with various women across the cumulative early years. The most substantial single relationship had been with Yola Letellier, the wife of a French newspaper magnate, whose substantial relationship with Mountbatten had extended across the cumulative period of approximately 3 decades. Edwina had been substantially involved with various men across the cumulative early years. The cumulative reality had been the kind of substantial open marriage that the cumulative period had been substantially producing. What Loney's biography has substantially preserved is the specific framing of how the open marriage had operated. The framing was substantial. Mountbatten had been substantially jealous of Edwina's affairs during the cumulative early period when his own affairs had not yet substantially developed. Once his own affairs had substantially developed, he had been substantially less jealous of Edwina's affairs. Edwina, by contrast, had been substantially jealous of Mountbatten's affairs across the cumulative period of the marriage. The differential had been substantial. The differential had been the cumulative reality that the marriage had been substantially organized around. The substantial Yola Letellier relationship had been the most substantial single dimension of Mountbatten's affairs across the cumulative early period. The relationship had begun in 1925. Mountbatten had been 25. Yola had been 18. The relationship had been conducted with the cumulative discretion that the period had been substantially organizing for such matters. The cumulative documentation has preserved Mountbatten's substantial commitment to Yola across the cumulative period. The substantial letters, the substantial travel arrangements, the substantial financial support that Mountbatten had been substantially providing across the cumulative period. The cumulative relationship had been substantial. The cumulative relationship had been one of the foundational features of Mountbatten's romantic life across the cumulative subsequent decades. What Edwina had been doing across the same cumulative period had been the substantial pursuit of her own romantic life. The cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved her relationships with various men across the cumulative period. The most substantial single relationship of the cumulative early period had been with Mike Wardell, the British newspaper figure whose substantial relationship with Edwina had extended across the cumulative period of approximately 3 years. Other substantial relationships had included Hugh Molyneux, the Earl of Sefton, whose substantial relationship with Edwina had been preserved across the documentary record. The cumulative pattern had been substantial. The most substantial single love affair of Edwina's cumulative early period had been with Major Hugh "Bunny" Phillips of the Coldstream Guards. The relationship had begun in 1933. Edwina was 31, Bunny was 28. The relationship had been, by every available account from the cumulative documentary record, the substantial love of Edwina's cumulative life across the period. The cumulative letters that have been preserved across the documentary record substantially documented the depth of Edwina's substantial attachment to Bunny across the cumulative period. What the cumulative substantial relationship with Bunny had also produced was the substantial cumulative pain that Edwina had absorbed when the relationship had eventually ended. Bunny had eventually married another woman, Gina Wernher, whose substantial introduction to Bunny had actually been substantially conducted by Edwina herself. The cumulative humiliation had been substantial. Edwina had introduced Bunny to the woman who had eventually substantially taken him from her. The cumulative pattern had been the kind of substantial private humiliation that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. What had also been operating across the cumulative period of the early marriage was the substantial production of the 2 daughters that the marriage had been substantially organized to produce. Patricia had been born on the 14th of February, 1924, the substantial first child, whose cumulative subsequent decades would substantially define many dimensions of the family's cumulative institutional position. Pamela had been born on the 19th of April, 1929, the substantial second daughter, who would, across the cumulative period, become substantially close to the senior royal family through her cumulative position as a lady-in-waiting to Princess Elizabeth, and through her cumulative subsequent marriage to David Hicks. The 2 daughters had been substantially raised, across the cumulative period of their childhoods, inside the substantial institutional reality that the marriage had been substantially producing. They had been substantially absent parents across the cumulative period. Both Mountbatten and Edwina had been substantially absorbed by their respective cumulative priorities. Mountbatten's substantial naval career, Edwina's substantial social and romantic life. The 2 daughters had been substantially raised by nannies, governesses, and the substantial domestic staff that the cumulative wealth had been substantially organizing. The cumulative effect on Patricia and Pamela has been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Both daughters had absorbed the substantial reality of their parents' cumulative absence across their cumulative childhoods. Both daughters had developed the substantial institutional discipline that their particular position had been substantially organizing them to produce. Both daughters had eventually emerged from the cumulative childhood as the substantial institutional figures that their cumulative subsequent decades would substantially confirm. The cumulative cost of their parents' marriage had been substantial. The cumulative cost had been substantially absorbed by the 2 daughters across the cumulative period. What had also been operating across the cumulative period was the substantial development of the relationship between Mountbatten and the substantial figure of his nephew Philip that would, across the cumulative subsequent decades, substantially define many dimensions of Mountbatten's institutional position. Philip had been born on the 10th of June, 1921, 18 months before Mountbatten's substantial wedding to Edwina. Philip was Mountbatten's substantial sister Alice's only son. Philip's substantial childhood had been substantially complicated by the cumulative institutional pressures that the cumulative period had been substantially imposing on his family. The Greek royal family, Philip's substantial paternal family, had been substantially exiled from Greece in 1922 when Philip had been approximately 18 months old. The cumulative subsequent years of Philip's substantial childhood had been substantially organized around the cumulative reality of being substantially stateless. substantially exiled, and substantially without the substantial institutional support that other senior royal children of the period had been substantially benefiting from. Philip's substantial mother Alice had been substantially institutionalized for mental illness across the cumulative period of Philip's middle childhood. She had been substantially diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1930 and had been substantially confined to a psychiatric clinic in Switzerland across the cumulative period of approximately the next decade. Philip's substantial father had been substantially absent. Andrew had been substantially living in Monte Carlo with his substantial mistress across the cumulative period. What Mountbatten had begun to register, across the cumulative period of Philip's substantial childhood, was the substantial institutional opportunity that Philip's particular position had been substantially producing. Philip was a member of the substantial Greek royal family. Philip was Mountbatten's substantial nephew. Philip's substantial future would, by the cumulative institutional logic that Mountbatten's particular character had been substantially registering, substantially depend on the substantial institutional support that Mountbatten could substantially provide. The cumulative recognition had been the substantial foundation that the cumulative subsequent engineering of Philip's substantial marriage to the future queen would substantially draw on. The cumulative institutional dynamics had been substantially developing across the cumulative period of the 1920s and 1930s. Mountbatten had been substantially registering the substantial future institutional opportunity that Philip's particular position had been substantially producing. Mountbatten had been substantially organizing himself across the cumulative period around the deliberate institutional preparation that Philip's substantial future position would substantially require. The cumulative engineering had been substantially beginning across the cumulative period that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. What this part has been examining is the substantial reality of the marriage that the public version had been substantially organized to conceal. The reality had been substantial. The reality had included the substantial financial calculation that had substantially organized Mountbatten's pursuit of Edwina. The reality had included the cumulative open marriage that both partners had been substantially conducting across the cumulative period. The reality had included the substantial mutual humiliations that the cumulative period had been substantially producing. The reality had also included the substantial genuine affection that the cumulative subsequent years had substantially developed between the two partners despite the substantial complications that the marriage had been substantially organized around. Both pictures of the marriage had been substantially real. The substantial public version, the glittering institutional partnership of two substantial figures of the cumulative period, had been substantially accurate in its institutional dimensions. The substantial private reality, the open marriage, the affairs, the mutual humiliations, the substantial costs absorbed by both partners had been substantially accurate in its private dimensions. Both had been operating together across the cumulative period of the cumulative subsequent decades. The cumulative pattern had been the substantial reality that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. In the part that follows, we move to the substantial dimension of Mountbatten's particular institutional manipulation that the cumulative documentary record has most substantially preserved, the engineering of Philip's substantial marriage to the future Queen Elizabeth II. The 1939 Dartmouth meeting that had been substantially organized by Mountbatten and the substantial reigning Queen Mother. The cumulative letters between Mountbatten and King George VI that have been substantially preserved through Loney's substantial research. The cumulative institutional management of Philip's substantial naturalization, his substantial naval career, his substantial selection of the Mountbatten surname. The cumulative engineering of the substantial relationship between Philip and Elizabeth across the cumulative period of approximately a decade. The substantial 1947 wedding that had substantially confirmed the cumulative engineering. What Philip had absorbed across the cumulative period of being substantially managed by his substantial uncle. The complicated cumulative relationship that the cumulative engineering had substantially produced. The substantial engineering had been operating across the cumulative period of approximately a decade before the substantial moment at which its institutional success had been substantially confirmed. The most substantial single piece of documentary evidence that Andrew Lowney's 2019 biography had substantially preserved had been the cumulative letters between Mountbatten and King George VI that the biographical research had substantially identified. The letters had documented in the substantial details that the cumulative correspondence had substantially preserved the deliberate institutional engineering that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting across the cumulative period. The engineering had begun across the cumulative period of the late 1930s. Mountbatten had been substantially registering across the cumulative period the substantial institutional opportunity that his nephew Philip's particular position had been substantially producing. Philip had been born on the 10th of June 1921 in Mon Repos Villa on the substantial island of Corfu. Philip was the substantial son of Mountbatten's substantial sister Alice. Philip's substantial paternal family, the Greek royal family, had been substantially exiled from Greece across the cumulative period of his earliest months. Philip's substantial mother, Alice, had been substantially institutionalized for mental illness across the cumulative period of his middle childhood. The cumulative reality of Philip's substantial position had been the substantial institutional opportunity that Mountbatten had been substantially registering. Philip had been substantially without the institutional support that other senior royal children of the period had been substantially benefiting from. Philip had been substantially in need of the kind of substantial institutional management that Mountbatten could substantially provide. Philip had been, by the cumulative institutional logic that Mountbatten's particular character had been substantially producing, the substantial future institutional resource that Mountbatten could substantially manage toward the substantial outcome that his particular ambition had been substantially organizing. What Mountbatten had begun substantially organizing across the cumulative period of the late 1930s had been the deliberate institutional positioning of Philip toward the substantial future marriage that Mountbatten had been substantially identifying as the institutional outcome of the cumulative engineering. The substantial target of the engineering had been Princess Elizabeth, the substantial elder daughter of King George VI and the substantial heir presumptive to the British throne. Elizabeth had been born on the 21st of April, 1926. Elizabeth had been 5 years younger than Philip. The cumulative age differential had been substantially organized around the substantial institutional logic that Mountbatten's particular character had been substantially producing. The substantial first documented moment at which the engineering had been substantially operating in the institutional reality had occurred at the substantial Dartmouth visit of July 1939. The substantial visit had been organized as the cumulative institutional event in which King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the substantial reigning monarchs, had toured the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, with their two substantial daughters Elizabeth, then 13, and Margaret, then 9. The visit had been the cumulative institutional moment at which Mountbatten had substantially organized the deliberate institutional positioning that the cumulative subsequent decades would substantially confirm. The substantial engineering of the Dartmouth moment had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Mountbatten had been substantially present at the Naval College in his substantial capacity as the substantial naval officer whose substantial position had organized the cumulative tour. Mountbatten had been substantially in conversation with the Queen across the cumulative period of the visit. Mountbatten had substantially proposed in the cumulative institutional moment that the visit had substantially produced that Philip, who was substantially serving as a cadet at the Naval College, should substantially escort the substantial royal princesses across the cumulative period of the visit. The substantial proposal had been substantially accepted. Philip, at age 18, had been substantially deployed across the cumulative period of the visit to substantially escort Elizabeth, 13, and Margaret, 9. The cumulative substantial interaction between Philip and Elizabeth across the visit had been the substantial institutional moment that Mountbatten had been substantially organizing. The cumulative interaction had been substantial. The cumulative interaction had substantially produced what every subsequent account of Elizabeth's substantial life has preserved: the substantial first registration in Elizabeth's substantial young mind of Philip as the substantial romantic figure whose subsequent decades would substantially define her cumulative life. What the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved is the substantial institutional reality that Mountbatten had been substantially organizing the cumulative interaction with the substantial deliberate intention that has been preserved across the cumulative biographical examinations. Loney's substantial research had substantially identified the cumulative letters between Mountbatten and the substantial King George VI that had substantially documented the deliberate engineering. The letters had been substantial. The letters had substantially confirmed that the cumulative institutional positioning of Philip and Elizabeth had been the substantial deliberate institutional project that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting across the cumulative period. The substantial position that Loney has substantially preserved has been specific. It was Mountbatten in cahoots with the monarch who engineered Princess Elizabeth's and Prince Philip of Greece's romance. The framing was substantial. The framing was substantially documented. The cumulative engineering had been substantial. What had also been operating across the cumulative period of the substantial engineering had been the substantial institutional management of Philip's cumulative position that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting in the various dimensions that the cumulative period required. Philip had been substantially naturalized as a British subject across the cumulative period leading up to the substantial 1947 marriage. The substantial naturalization had been institutionally complicated by Philip's substantial Greek and Danish royal positions that had to be substantially renounced. The substantial naturalization had been organized substantially by Mountbatten's cumulative institutional management. The substantial selection of the Mountbatten surname for Philip had been the substantial institutional moment at which Mountbatten's particular ambition had been substantially manifested in the cumulative reality. Philip had been substantially required by the cumulative institutional logic of the naturalization to substantially adopt a substantial British surname. The cumulative options had been several. The Greek surname Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg had been substantially impractical. The institutional alternatives had included various substantial possibilities. The cumulative selection had been Mountbatten, the substantial maternal family name that Mountbatten himself had been substantially organizing into the substantial institutional position that the cumulative period had been substantially producing. The substantial selection had had specific cumulative institutional consequences. Philip had been substantially absorbed by the cumulative selection into the substantial Mountbatten family line. Mountbatten had been by the cumulative selection substantially confirmed as Philip's substantial institutional patron. The cumulative future generations of the substantial British royal family would, by the cumulative effect of the selection, substantially carry the Mountbatten surname through the substantial Mountbatten-Windsor compromise that the cumulative subsequent decades would substantially produce. What Mountbatten had also been substantially conducting across the cumulative period leading up to the substantial 1947 wedding had been the substantial management of Philip's continuing relationship with Elizabeth across the cumulative period of approximately 7 years between the Dartmouth visit and the substantial proposal. The cumulative documentation has substantially preserved Mountbatten's continuing institutional management across the cumulative period. He had substantially arranged the cumulative meetings between Philip and Elizabeth across the cumulative period. He had substantially advised Philip on the cumulative institutional positioning that the cumulative relationship had been substantially requiring. He had substantially provided the cumulative institutional support that Philip's particular position had been substantially needing. The substantial proposal had occurred in the summer of 1946. Philip had been 25. Elizabeth had been 20. The substantial proposal had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record as the substantial institutional moment at which the cumulative engineering had been substantially confirmed. Philip had asked George VI for Elizabeth's substantial hand in marriage. George VI had granted the substantial request, provided that any substantial formal engagement be substantially delayed until Elizabeth's substantial 21st birthday the following April. The substantial conditions had been the cumulative institutional management that the substantial reigning monarch had been substantially imposing on the cumulative situation. What had also been operating across the cumulative period leading up to the substantial wedding had been the substantial institutional resistance from various dimensions of the senior royal family that Mountbatten's cumulative engineering had been substantially producing. The most substantial single source of the resistance had been Queen Elizabeth, the substantial reigning monarch's wife, who would across the cumulative subsequent decades become substantially known as the Queen Mother. Queen Elizabeth had been substantially registering, across the cumulative period of the late 1930s and early 1940s, the substantial engineering that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting. The substantial reservations had specific dimensions. Queen Elizabeth had registered Philip's substantial foreign origins, the substantial Greek and Danish royal positions that had substantially defined his substantial paternal family across the cumulative period. Queen Elizabeth had registered Philip's substantial connections to various German royal families. Philip's substantial sisters had all married substantial German aristocrats, including some who had been substantially associated with the Nazi regime across the cumulative period of the recently concluded Second World War. Queen Elizabeth had registered Philip's substantial financial inadequacy. Philip had been substantially without the substantial private wealth that the cumulative institutional expectations for senior royal partners had been substantially organizing around. Queen Elizabeth had registered by the cumulative effect of these reservations the substantial concern that Philip had been the substantial wrong choice for Elizabeth. The substantial reservations had not been substantially adequate to overcome the cumulative engineering that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting. Elizabeth's substantial personal preference had been substantially organized around Philip across the cumulative period of approximately a decade. The substantial preference had been the cumulative effect of the engineering that Mountbatten had begun at Dartmouth in 1939. The cumulative engineering had been substantially successful. The substantial wedding would be substantially conducted regardless of the substantial reservations that Queen Elizabeth had been substantially registering. The wedding occurred on the 20th of November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. The substantial institutional event had been one of the substantial moments of the cumulative post-war British period. The substantial broadcast had reached an estimated audience of 200 million across the cumulative international markets. The substantial institutional unity that the wedding had been substantially producing had been the substantial cumulative outcome that Mountbatten had been substantially engineering across the cumulative period of approximately a decade. What Philip had absorbed, across the cumulative period of the substantial engineering, had been the substantial reality that has been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. The substantial reality had been complicated. Philip had been, by every available account from those who observed the cumulative period, substantially grateful to Mountbatten for the substantial institutional opportunity that the cumulative engineering had substantially produced. Philip had also been, by the same cumulative documentary record, substantially resentful of Mountbatten's substantial institutional control of his cumulative life. The substantial combination had been the cumulative reality that the relationship between the two figures had been substantially organized around across the cumulative subsequent decades. The substantial framing that has been preserved across the cumulative documentary record has been specific. The substantial relationship between Mountbatten and Philip had been substantially organized around the cumulative dynamics of love-hate. The substantial framing that various biographical accounts have substantially produced. Philip had loved Mountbatten as the substantial institutional figure who had been the substantial closest thing to a substantial paternal figure that his cumulative childhood had been substantially organizing him around. Philip had also resented Mountbatten as the substantial institutional figure who had substantially controlled his cumulative life in dimensions that Philip had not, by every available account, been substantially organized to fully accept. What the cumulative period had also produced across Philip's particular development had been the substantial institutional discipline that the cumulative engineering had been substantially producing. Philip had absorbed, across the cumulative period of being substantially managed by Mountbatten, the substantial institutional approach that his subsequent decades as the substantial consort of the British monarch would substantially require. Philip had been substantially formed, by the cumulative engineering, into the substantial figure whose subsequent institutional position had been substantially adequate to the demands of his eventual role. The cumulative consequences had been substantial. Philip had become, across the cumulative subsequent decades, the substantial figure whose institutional partnership with Elizabeth had substantially organized many dimensions of the cumulative post-war British monarchy. Mountbatten had become, by the cumulative effect of the engineering, the substantial institutional figure whose particular position had been substantially confirmed by his substantial role in producing the cumulative outcome. Both figures had benefited in their respective dimensions from the cumulative engineering that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting across the cumulative period. What had also been operating across the cumulative subsequent decades after the substantial 1947 wedding had been the substantial cumulative dynamic between Mountbatten and Philip that the cumulative engineering had substantially produced. Philip had been, across the cumulative subsequent decades, substantially registering the cumulative institutional control that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting. Philip had been, by various accounts that have been preserved across the cumulative documentary record, substantially attempting to resist Mountbatten's continuing institutional management across the cumulative subsequent period. The cumulative resistance had been substantial. The most substantial single dimension of Philip's cumulative resistance had been the substantial institutional crisis of 1952, that the cumulative subsequent part of this documentary will examine. The crisis had been substantially produced by Mountbatten's substantial declaration that the House of Mountbatten now reigns, upon Elizabeth's substantial accession to the throne. The substantial declaration had been the substantial institutional moment at which Mountbatten's cumulative ambition had been substantially manifested in the cumulative reality. The substantial declaration had been the cumulative institutional crisis that the senior royal family had been substantially organizing to address. What this part has been examining is the substantial dimension of Mountbatten's institutional manipulation that the cumulative documentary record has most substantially preserved. The engineering of Philip's substantial marriage to Elizabeth had been substantial. The engineering had been substantially documented. The engineering had been the cumulative institutional achievement that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting across the cumulative period of approximately a decade. The cumulative outcome had been the substantial 1947 wedding that had substantially confirmed the engineering. What the engineering had also revealed about Mountbatten, in retrospective examination, had been the substantial pattern that the cumulative subsequent parts of this documentary will substantially examine. Mountbatten had been the substantial institutional figure whose particular character had been substantially organized around the cumulative manipulation of the institutional dynamics around him. The cumulative manipulation had been substantial. The cumulative manipulation had produced specific outcomes. The cumulative outcomes had been substantial. In the part that follows, we move to the substantial dimension of Mountbatten's cumulative institutional achievements that has been the subject of substantial subsequent reassessment across the cumulative documentary record. The substantial naval career that had been substantially organized around the cumulative institutional positions that his royal connections had substantially made available. The substantial 1941 sinking of HMS Kelly, the substantial ship that Mountbatten had been substantially commanding when it had been substantially sunk in the Mediterranean. The substantial 1942 Dieppe Raid, the substantial catastrophic operation that had killed approximately 1,400 Allied soldiers and that Mountbatten had been substantially responsible for. The substantial cumulative manipulation of the historical record that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting across the cumulative subsequent decades to substantially conceal his cumulative responsibility for the catastrophes. The cumulative self-mythologization that had substantially defined his cumulative institutional position across the cumulative subsequent decades. The next part will examine the cumulative disasters and the cumulative institutional manipulation of the historical record that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting across the cumulative period. The substantial naval career that Mountbatten had been pursuing across the cumulative period of the 1920s and 1930s had been substantially organized around the cumulative institutional positions that his substantial royal connections had been substantially making available. The cumulative positions had been substantial. The cumulative positions had included various command appointments that the substantial framework of the Royal Navy had been substantially organizing for him. The cumulative positions had also been by the substantial assessment that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved, frequently beyond what his cumulative documented competence had been substantially organized to absorb. The substantial assessment of his cumulative naval competence has been preserved across multiple authoritative sources. The naval historian Stephen Roskill, whose cumulative work on British naval history has been substantially authoritative across the cumulative period, produced the substantial framing that has been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Roskill had concluded that Mountbatten's particular naval career had been substantially organized around his cumulative royal connections, rather than around his cumulative documented competence. Roeskill's substantial framing had been the substantial institutional warning that Mountbatten's testimony should never be relied on unless it was supported by independent evidence. What Roeskill had been substantially registering by the cumulative framing had been the substantial pattern of Mountbatten's cumulative manipulation of the cumulative historical record about his cumulative naval career. The cumulative manipulation had been substantial. The cumulative manipulation had operated across multiple dimensions of his cumulative naval positions across the cumulative period. The cumulative manipulation had produced across the cumulative subsequent decades the substantial public version of his cumulative naval achievements that had been substantially adequate to the substantial institutional position that his cumulative royal connections had been substantially organizing. The substantial first major catastrophe of his cumulative naval career had occurred in May 1941. HMS Kelly, the substantial destroyer that Mountbatten had been substantially commanding since June 1939, had been substantially sunk in the substantial waters off the substantial coast of Crete during the substantial Battle of Crete. The substantial sinking had been the cumulative outcome of a substantial sequence of operational decisions that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as having been substantially inadequate to the cumulative circumstances the ship had been substantially operating in. The cumulative pattern of HMS Kelly's substantial operational history under Mountbatten's substantial command had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. The substantial ship had been substantially commissioned in August 1939. The substantial ship had been substantially involved in a cumulative sequence of substantial incidents across the cumulative period that followed. The substantial ship had been substantially damaged by a substantial mine in December 1939. The substantial ship had been substantially damaged in a substantial collision with another substantial Royal Navy vessel in January 1940. The substantial ship had been substantially torpedoed by a substantial German E-boat in May 1940. The substantial ship had been substantially damaged in a substantial collision with another substantial Royal Navy vessel in November 1940. The substantial cumulative pattern of damage had been the substantial institutional record that Mountbatten's cumulative command of HMS Kelly had been substantially producing. The cumulative pattern had not been entirely the substantial result of Mountbatten's cumulative command. The substantial operational conditions of the Royal Navy across the cumulative period of the early Second World War had been substantially producing substantial incidents across the cumulative fleet. The substantial cumulative pattern had been the substantial reality that the substantial wartime conditions had been substantially organizing. What the cumulative pattern had also revealed, however, by the substantial assessment that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved, had been the substantial dimension of Mountbatten's cumulative command approach that the cumulative incidents had been substantially manifesting. The substantial assessment has been preserved across multiple sources. Mountbatten had been by the cumulative observation of those who served under him across the cumulative period of HMS Kelly's substantial operation, the substantial commander whose cumulative approach had been substantially organized around the substantial pursuit of substantial institutional glory, rather than around the cumulative practical demands of the substantial operational situations the ship had been substantially encountering. The substantial approach had been substantial. The substantial approach had been the cumulative institutional reality that the cumulative pattern of incidents had been substantially producing. The final sinking of HMS Kelly on the 23rd of May 1941 had been the cumulative outcome of Mountbatten's substantial decision to substantially engage with substantial German air attacks in the substantial waters off Crete during the substantial cumulative period of the substantial Allied evacuation from the island. The substantial decision had been the cumulative institutional moment at which Mountbatten's cumulative pattern of substantial engagement had been substantially produced. The substantial ship had been substantially sunk by substantial German dive bombers. The substantial casualties had been substantial. Approximately 130 of the substantial ship's substantial company had been killed. Mountbatten had been substantially rescued from the substantial water by another substantial Royal Navy vessel. The substantial cumulative outcome had been the cumulative end of HMS Kelly's substantial operational history. What had also been operating across the cumulative period that followed the substantial sinking had been the substantial cumulative manipulation of the historical record that Mountbatten had begun substantially conducting. The substantial sinking had been the cumulative institutional moment at which Mountbatten's particular character had been substantially organized to substantially produce the substantial institutional narrative that the cumulative subsequent decades would substantially preserve. The substantial sinking had been substantially reframed by the cumulative institutional management that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting as the substantial heroic moment of his cumulative naval career, rather than as the cumulative operational catastrophe that the cumulative documentary record would substantially reveal. The most substantial single instrument of the cumulative reframing had been the substantial 1942 film In Which We Serve, the substantial Royal Navy propaganda film that had been substantially produced by Noel Coward in collaboration with Mountbatten. The substantial film had been substantially based on the cumulative story of HMS Kelly's substantial operational history. The substantial film had been substantially organized around the substantial heroic narrative that Mountbatten had been substantially producing. The substantial film had been substantially successful. By the cumulative measure of contemporary box office receipts, it had been one of the substantial cinematic successes of 1942. The substantial film had substantially confirmed, in the cumulative public imagination, the substantial heroic version of Mountbatten's cumulative naval command that the cumulative subsequent decades had been substantially organizing around. What the substantial film had not substantially registered by the cumulative institutional reality had been the substantial cumulative pattern of operational catastrophes that HMS Kelly's substantial operational history had been substantially producing under Mountbatten's substantial command. The cumulative pattern had been substantially absent from the substantial film. The substantial film had been substantially organized around the cumulative heroic dimension. The cumulative operational catastrophes had been substantially absent from the cumulative public version. What this had revealed about Mountbatten, in retrospective examination, had been the cumulative pattern of substantial self-mythologization that the cumulative subsequent decades would substantially preserve. He had been substantially organized across his cumulative life around the substantial deliberate institutional management of his own cumulative historical record. He had been substantially organized around the substantial deliberate production of the cumulative public version of his cumulative career that the substantial institutional position had been substantially requiring. He had been substantially organized by the cumulative effect of his particular character around the substantial cumulative manipulation of the cumulative reality to substantially produce the substantial institutional outcome that his cumulative ambition had been substantially organizing around. The substantial second major catastrophe of his cumulative naval career had occurred in August 1942. The substantial Dieppe Raid, the substantial Allied operation against the substantial German-occupied French coastal town of Dieppe, had been substantially conducted on the 19th of August, 1942. The substantial operation had been substantially under the cumulative institutional responsibility of the Combined Operations Headquarters, which Mountbatten had been substantially commanding since April 1942. The substantial operation had been the substantial catastrophe that the cumulative subsequent assessments would substantially preserve. The substantial casualties of the Dieppe Raid had been substantial. Approximately 6,000 Allied soldiers had been substantially involved in the substantial operation. Approximately 1,400 had been killed. Approximately 2,000 had been captured by the substantial German forces. The substantial overall casualty rate had exceeded 60% of the substantial forces engaged. The substantial operation had been, by every available subsequent assessment, one of the substantial military catastrophes of the cumulative Allied war effort. The substantial cumulative responsibility for the catastrophe has been the subject of substantial subsequent historical examination. The cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved the substantial conclusion that Mountbatten, as the substantial commanding officer of combined operations, had been substantially responsible for the substantial operation. The cumulative operational decisions that had substantially produced the catastrophe had been substantially made under his cumulative institutional authority. The cumulative planning failures that had substantially organized the cumulative catastrophe had been substantially conducted under his cumulative institutional supervision. The cumulative substantial responsibility had been substantial. What had also been operating across the cumulative period that followed the substantial Dieppe Raid had been the substantial cumulative manipulation of the historical record that Mountbatten had begun substantially conducting almost immediately. The substantial cumulative reframing had been substantial. The substantial reframing had been substantially organized around the cumulative argument that the substantial Dieppe Raid had been the substantial institutional learning experience that had substantially produced the cumulative institutional preparation for the substantial 1944 Normandy landings. The substantial argument had been the cumulative institutional defense that Mountbatten had been substantially organizing across the cumulative subsequent decades. The substantial argument had not been entirely without substantial cumulative merit. The cumulative Normandy landings had substantially benefited from substantial lessons that the cumulative experience of the Dieppe Raid had substantially produced. The substantial institutional learning had been substantial. The substantial institutional learning had not, however, substantially compensated for the cumulative human cost that the substantial Dieppe Raid had imposed on the cumulative Allied soldiers who had been substantially killed and captured. The substantial human cost had been substantial. The substantial human cost had been the cumulative reality that Mountbatten's substantial institutional defense had been substantially organized to substantially manage rather than substantially acknowledge. The cumulative subsequent biographical assessments have substantially preserved the substantial cumulative pattern. Anthony Eden, the substantial British Prime Minister whose cumulative career had substantially intersected with Mountbatten's across the cumulative period, produced the substantial framing that has been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Eden characterized Mountbatten as a congenital liar. The substantial framing had been the cumulative substantial assessment that Eden's cumulative institutional position had been substantially organizing across the cumulative period. The substantial framing had been substantial. The substantial framing had been the cumulative institutional reality that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. What the cumulative pattern of substantial naval failures had not, however, substantially prevented, had been the cumulative subsequent institutional rise that Mountbatten's cumulative career had been substantially producing. The cumulative substantial promotions had continued across the cumulative subsequent period, despite the cumulative catastrophes. Mountbatten had been substantially appointed Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia Command in October 1943, the cumulative substantial position that had substantially organized the cumulative Allied military operations across the cumulative substantial theater of the war. The substantial appointment had been substantial. The substantial appointment had been the cumulative institutional confirmation that Mountbatten's substantial royal connections had been substantially producing the cumulative institutional outcomes that his cumulative documented competence had not, by the cumulative assessment that has been preserved across the cumulative documentary record, been substantially producing. What this revealed about the cumulative institutional reality that Mountbatten had been substantially operating inside has been substantial. The cumulative institutional reality had been substantially organized around the substantial mechanism by which substantial royal connection could substantially compensate for the cumulative absence of substantial documented competence. The substantial mechanism had been the cumulative institutional reality that the British Royal Navy of the cumulative period had been substantially operating inside. The substantial mechanism had been the cumulative institutional reality that Mountbatten's particular cumulative career had been substantially benefiting from across the cumulative period. The substantial Southeast Asia Command position had been the cumulative institutional context in which Mountbatten's cumulative substantial achievements had been substantially produced. The substantial Allied operations across Burma had been substantially conducted under his cumulative institutional supervision. The substantial Japanese surrender at Singapore in September 1945 had been substantially organized under his cumulative institutional authority. The substantial post-war institutional position had been substantially preserved across the cumulative period as the substantial institutional achievement that had substantially organized Mountbatten's cumulative substantial subsequent positions. What the cumulative achievements had also been substantially organized around had been the cumulative substantial pattern of self-mythologization that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting across the cumulative period. The substantial achievements had been substantially real. The substantial achievements had also been substantially exaggerated across the cumulative subsequent decades through the substantial cumulative mechanisms that Mountbatten's particular character had been substantially organizing. The substantial cumulative reality had been the substantial combination of substantial real achievements and substantial cumulative exaggerations that the substantial cumulative public version had been substantially organized to substantially produce. The cumulative institutional culmination of the substantial wartime career had been the substantial 1947 appointment as the substantial last Viceroy of India. The substantial appointment had been the cumulative institutional moment at which Mountbatten's cumulative substantial career had been substantially organized into the substantial institutional position that the cumulative subsequent decades would substantially preserve as the cumulative substantial high point of his cumulative public service. The substantial appointment had been substantial. The substantial appointment had been the cumulative institutional context in which the substantial cumulative catastrophe of the partition of India would be substantially conducted. What this part has been examining has been the substantial cumulative pattern of substantial military failures alongside the substantial cumulative manipulation of the historical record that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting. The cumulative pattern had been substantial. The cumulative pattern had been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record. The cumulative pattern had been the substantial cumulative reality that the cumulative public version of Mountbatten's cumulative career had been substantially organized to substantially conceal. The cumulative substantial achievement that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved had been the substantial institutional reality that Mountbatten's cumulative career had been substantially organized around. The substantial institutional reality had been the cumulative substantial mechanism by which substantial royal connection had been substantially compensating for the substantial absence of cumulative documented competence. The substantial cumulative mechanism had been the substantial institutional reality that the cumulative subsequent decades would substantially confirm. The substantial cumulative achievements that had been substantially real, the substantial Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia position, the substantial 1955 First Sea Lord position that had substantially vindicated his father's earlier institutional humiliation, the various substantial post-war institutional appointments had been substantial. The substantial achievements had been substantially earned through the cumulative substantial institutional positions that Mountbatten's cumulative substantial royal connections had been substantially producing for him. The substantial achievements had not, by the cumulative assessment that has been preserved across the cumulative documentary record, been substantially proportionate to the cumulative substantial documented competence that Mountbatten's cumulative substantial career had been substantially producing. In the part that follows, we move to the substantial single catastrophe that Mountbatten's cumulative substantial career had been most substantially organized around, the substantial 1947 Partition of India. The substantial cumulative decision to accelerate the cumulative timeline for substantial Indian independence from the substantial original date of June 1948 to the substantial accelerated date of August 1947. The substantial cumulative decision to substantially require Cyril Radcliffe, the substantial British lawyer whose cumulative knowledge of India had been substantially limited, to substantially draw the cumulative borders between the new India and Pakistan across the substantial period of approximately 5 weeks. The substantial cumulative catastrophe of the religious violence that had substantially followed, the substantial cumulative deaths of approximately 1 to 2 million people across the cumulative period of August and September 1947, the substantial cumulative displacement of approximately 15 million people across the cumulative period, the substantial cumulative institutional decisions that Mountbatten had substantially made and that had substantially produced the cumulative catastrophe, the cumulative substantial attempt across his cumulative subsequent decades to substantially conceal his cumulative responsibility for the catastrophe. The next part will examine the substantial partition catastrophe and what it revealed about the substantial figure who had been substantially responsible for it. The substantial appointment had been made on the 20th of February, 1947. The substantial British Prime Minister Clement Attlee had announced in the substantial House of Commons that Lord Louis Mountbatten would be substantially appointed as the substantial last Viceroy of India. The substantial appointment had been the cumulative institutional moment at which the cumulative substantial decision to substantially withdraw British rule from India had been substantially organised into the cumulative substantial timeline that the cumulative subsequent months would substantially produce. The substantial cumulative context of the appointment had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. The British government had been substantially organised by the cumulative post-war period around the substantial recognition that the cumulative substantial maintenance of British rule in India had become institutionally unsustainable. The cumulative substantial Indian independence movement had been substantially producing the cumulative substantial political pressure that the cumulative British administrative position had been substantially absorbing. The cumulative substantial financial cost of maintaining the substantial Indian administration across the cumulative post-war period had been substantially exceeding what the cumulative substantial British exchequer had been substantially organising to provide. The cumulative substantial decision to withdraw had been institutionally substantial. The cumulative substantial decision had been organised around the substantial original timeline that the substantial British government had been substantially preparing. The cumulative substantial transfer of power was to be substantially completed by the substantial date of June 1948. The substantial timeline had been organised around the substantial institutional preparation that the cumulative substantial transition would substantially require. The substantial timeline had been the substantial cumulative institutional reality that Mountbatten had been substantially appointed to substantially manage. What Mountbatten had begun substantially producing across the cumulative substantial period of his appointment and his substantial arrival in India on the 22nd of March 1947 had been the substantial cumulative decision to substantially accelerate the cumulative timeline. The substantial decision had been substantially made by Mountbatten in consultation with the substantial cumulative figures of the substantial Indian National Congress and the substantial Muslim League. The substantial decision had been substantially announced on the 3rd of June 1947. The substantial cumulative timeline for the substantial transfer of power had been substantially accelerated from June 1948 to August 15, 1947. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The cumulative substantial acceleration had been substantial. The substantial cumulative acceleration had compressed the cumulative substantial institutional preparation that the substantial transfer of power would substantially require from approximately 18 months to approximately 10 weeks. The substantial cumulative acceleration had been substantial. The substantial cumulative acceleration had been the substantial decision that Mountbatten had been substantially producing. What the cumulative substantial acceleration had been substantially organised around had been the substantial cumulative reasoning that Mountbatten had been substantially producing. The substantial reasoning had specific dimensions. The substantial communal violence between the substantial Hindu and Muslim populations had been substantially intensifying across the cumulative substantial period of early 1947. The substantial cumulative violence had been substantially producing the substantial cumulative institutional argument that any cumulative substantial delay would substantially permit additional cumulative violence to substantially develop. The substantial cumulative argument had been substantially adequate to the substantial decision that the cumulative timeline should be substantially accelerated. The substantial cumulative argument had not, however, been entirely substantially adequate to the substantial cumulative reality that the substantial acceleration would substantially produce. The substantial cumulative reality had been substantial. The substantial cumulative reality had been the cumulative substantial institutional preparation that the substantial transfer of power would substantially require. The cumulative substantial institutional preparation had not been substantially adequate. The cumulative substantial institutional preparation had been substantially adequate. The cumulative substantial inadequacy would substantially produce the cumulative catastrophe that the cumulative subsequent months would substantially deliver. The substantial single most consequential dimension of the cumulative substantial inadequacy had been the substantial cumulative arrangement for the substantial drawing of the cumulative borders between the substantial new states of India and Pakistan. The substantial cumulative arrangement had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial appointment of Cyril Radcliffe, the substantial British lawyer whose cumulative substantial position as a substantial King's Counsel had been substantially established across the cumulative previous decades. The substantial Radcliffe had been substantially appointed to chair the substantial boundary commissions that would substantially draw the cumulative borders. What the substantial Radcliffe had brought to the substantial appointment had been the cumulative substantial institutional reality that the cumulative subsequent assessments would substantially preserve. The substantial Radcliffe had never been substantially to India before his substantial appointment. The substantial Radcliffe had no substantial cumulative knowledge of the cumulative substantial geography, the cumulative substantial demographics, the cumulative substantial cultural and religious dynamics that his substantial cumulative work would substantially require him to substantially navigate. The substantial Radcliffe had been substantially given approximately 5 weeks from his substantial arrival in India on the 8th of July, 1947, to the substantial cumulative deadline for the substantial cumulative completion of the substantial boundary work, to substantially complete the cumulative substantial assignment. The substantial cumulative assignment had been substantial. The substantial cumulative assignment had been the substantial drawing of the cumulative substantial borders that would substantially determine the substantial cumulative future of approximately 400 million people. The substantial cumulative borders would substantially divide the cumulative substantial Punjab, the substantial cumulative northwestern region whose substantial cumulative population had been substantially mixed between Hindu, Muslim and Sikh communities. The substantial cumulative borders would substantially divide the cumulative substantial Bengal, the substantial cumulative eastern region whose substantial cumulative population had been substantially mixed between Hindu and Muslim communities. The substantial cumulative borders would substantially produce the cumulative substantial reality that approximately 15 million people would substantially find themselves, by the cumulative substantial outcome of the substantial Radcliffe substantial cumulative work, substantially on the wrong side of the cumulative substantial new borders. The substantial cumulative work had been substantially completed by the substantial Radcliffe in the cumulative substantial period of approximately 5 weeks. The substantial cumulative work had been substantially conducted from the substantial cumulative office in Delhi that the substantial cumulative institutional arrangement had substantially provided. The substantial cumulative work had been substantially produced through the cumulative substantial examination of substantial cumulative maps, substantial cumulative demographic data, and substantial cumulative testimony from the substantial cumulative figures of the cumulative substantial communities involved. The substantial cumulative work had been substantially submitted to the substantial cumulative institutional authorities on the 12th of August, 1947, 3 days before the substantial cumulative scheduled date of the substantial transfer of power. What the substantial cumulative decision had also been substantially organized around had been the substantial cumulative decision by the substantial cumulative institutional authorities, Mountbatten primary among them, to substantially withhold the substantial publication of the cumulative substantial borders until after the substantial transfer of power had been substantially completed. The substantial cumulative decision had been substantial. The substantial cumulative decision had been substantially organized around the substantial cumulative argument that the substantial cumulative publication of the cumulative substantial borders before the substantial transfer would substantially produce the cumulative substantial violence that the cumulative substantial institutional anxiety had been substantially anticipating. The substantial cumulative decision had been the cumulative substantial institutional management that the cumulative substantial subsequent reality would substantially fail to substantially contain. The substantial cumulative borders were substantially published on the 17th of August, 1947, 2 days after the substantial transfer of power had been substantially completed. The substantial cumulative publication had been the substantial cumulative institutional moment at which the substantial cumulative population had been substantially required to substantially register the substantial cumulative new reality that the substantial cumulative borders had substantially produced. The substantial cumulative population had been substantially required to substantially absorb, in the cumulative substantial moment of the publication, the substantial cumulative reality that their cumulative substantial homes were now substantially in the substantial cumulative wrong state for their substantial cumulative religious affiliation. The substantial cumulative violence had been substantial. The substantial cumulative violence had been the cumulative substantial reality that the substantial cumulative institutional management had substantially failed to substantially prevent. The substantial cumulative population had been substantially required by the cumulative substantial reality of the substantial cumulative borders to substantially undertake the substantial cumulative migration that the substantial cumulative new states had substantially produced. The substantial cumulative migration had been substantial. Approximately 15 million people had been substantially required to substantially relocate across the substantial cumulative new borders. The cumulative substantial relocation had been substantial. The cumulative substantial violence that had substantially accompanied the cumulative substantial relocation had been substantial. The substantial cumulative violence had been substantial. The substantial cumulative estimates have ranged across the cumulative subsequent decades from approximately 500,000 to approximately 2 million. The substantial cumulative midpoint estimate that the cumulative substantial historical record has substantially preserved has been approximately 1 million deaths. The substantial cumulative deaths had been substantial. The substantial cumulative violence had specific cumulative substantial dimensions. The substantial cumulative violence had included substantial cumulative massacres of substantial cumulative Hindu, Muslim and Sikh populations across the cumulative substantial regions affected by the cumulative substantial borders. The substantial cumulative violence had included substantial cumulative sexual violence against substantial cumulative women whose substantial cumulative number has been substantially estimated at approximately 75 to 100,000. The substantial cumulative violence had included substantial cumulative destruction of substantial cumulative property across the substantial cumulative regions affected. The substantial cumulative violence had been the cumulative substantial catastrophe that the substantial cumulative acceleration of the substantial cumulative timeline had substantially produced. The substantial cumulative responsibility for the cumulative catastrophe has been the subject of substantial cumulative historical examination across the cumulative subsequent decades. The cumulative substantial assessment that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved has been specific. Mountbatten had been the substantial cumulative institutional figure whose substantial cumulative decisions had substantial produced the cumulative substantial conditions in which the cumulative catastrophe had been substantial permitted to substantial develop. The substantial cumulative decision to substantial accelerate the cumulative substantial timeline had been substantial accelerate the Mountbattens. The substantial cumulative decision to substantially appoint Cyril Radcliffe, a substantial figure with no substantial cumulative knowledge of India, to substantially draw the substantial cumulative borders had been substantially Mountbatten's institutional responsibility. The cumulative substantial decision to substantially withhold the substantial publication of the cumulative substantial borders until after the substantial transfer of power had been substantially Mountbatten's institutional responsibility. The substantial cumulative pattern that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved has been specific. Mountbatten had been substantially organized across his cumulative substantial career around the cumulative substantial pursuit of substantial institutional glory rather than around the cumulative substantial practical demands of the substantial cumulative situations he had been substantially managing. The substantial cumulative pursuit had been substantial. The substantial cumulative pursuit had substantially produced, in the cumulative substantial case of the partition, the cumulative substantial catastrophe that the substantial cumulative acceleration of the substantial cumulative timeline had been substantially organized around. What Mountbatten had begun substantially conducting across the cumulative substantial period that followed the partition had been the substantial cumulative manipulation of the historical record that his substantial cumulative career had been substantially organized around. The substantial cumulative manipulation had been substantial. The substantial cumulative manipulation had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial argument that the cumulative catastrophe had been substantially the substantial cumulative responsibility of the cumulative substantial Indian political figures rather than the substantial cumulative British institutional management. The substantial cumulative argument had been substantial. The substantial cumulative argument had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial framing that the cumulative substantial communal tensions had been the substantial cumulative driver of the cumulative substantial violence rather than the substantial cumulative institutional decisions that Mountbatten had been substantially producing. The substantial cumulative argument had not been entirely substantially adequate to the cumulative substantial reality. The cumulative substantial communal tensions had been substantial. The cumulative substantial communal tensions had been substantial cumulative reality, that the substantial cumulative institutional decisions had been substantially operating inside. The cumulative substantial communal tensions had not, however, by the cumulative substantial assessment that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved, been substantially adequate to substantially produce the cumulative catastrophe in the substantial cumulative scale that the substantial cumulative reality had substantially delivered. The substantial cumulative catastrophe had been substantially produced by the cumulative substantial combination of the cumulative substantial communal tensions and the cumulative substantial institutional decisions that Mountbatten had been substantially producing. What had also been operating across the cumulative substantial period of the partition had been the substantial cumulative relationship between Edwina Mountbatten and the substantial cumulative first Prime Minister of India Jawaharlal Nehru. The substantial cumulative relationship had been substantial. The substantial cumulative relationship had been substantial cumulative dimension that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as one of the substantial cumulative complications of the cumulative substantial period. The substantial cumulative relationship between Edwina and Nehru had begun across the cumulative substantial period that the cumulative substantial viceroyalty had substantially produced. Nehru had been the substantial cumulative figure whose substantial cumulative institutional position had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial leadership of the substantial cumulative Indian National Congress. Nehru had been a substantial figure whose substantial cumulative education at the substantial cumulative British institutions of Harrow and Cambridge had substantially produced the cumulative substantial cultural compatibility with Edwina that the substantial cumulative relationship had been substantially organized around. The substantial cumulative relationship had been substantial. The substantial cumulative nature of the cumulative substantial relationship has been the subject of substantial cumulative historical examination. The substantial cumulative assessment that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved has been specific. The substantial cumulative relationship had been substantial intellectual companionship, substantial emotional attachment, substantial mutual affection that the cumulative substantial letters between the two had substantially documented across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades. Whether the substantial cumulative relationship had been substantially physical has been the subject of cumulative substantial historical debate. The substantial cumulative biographical examinations have been substantially divided on the substantial cumulative question. What had been substantially documented across the cumulative substantial period had been the substantial cumulative reality that Mountbatten had been substantially aware of the substantial cumulative relationship across the cumulative substantial period of the substantial cumulative development. Mountbatten had been substantially aware. Mountbatten had been by the cumulative substantial pattern of the cumulative open marriage that the substantial cumulative relationship between the Mountbattens had been substantially organized around, substantially permissive of Edwina's cumulative substantial pursuit of the substantial cumulative relationship with Nehru. The cumulative substantial permissiveness had been the substantial cumulative reality that the cumulative substantial Mountbatten marriage had been substantially organized around. What this had produced across the cumulative substantial period of the partition itself had been the substantial cumulative dimension that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. The substantial cumulative dimension had been the substantial cumulative reality that the cumulative substantial institutional relationships between the substantial cumulative British colonial authorities and the substantial cumulative Indian political leadership had been substantially mediated, in part, by the cumulative substantial personal relationship between Edwina and Nehru. The substantial cumulative mediation had been substantial. The substantial cumulative mediation had been one of the substantial cumulative institutional features that the cumulative substantial viceroyalty had been substantially producing. The substantial cumulative consequences of the cumulative substantial partition had extended across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades. The substantial cumulative consequences had included the substantial cumulative production of the cumulative substantial Kashmir dispute that has substantially defined the cumulative substantial relationship between the substantial cumulative new states of India and Pakistan across the cumulative substate. The substantial cumulative consequences had included the substantial cumulative wars between India and Pakistan in 1947–48, 1965, 1971 and 1999. The substantial cumulative consequences had included the substantial cumulative nuclear arms race between the substantial cumulative new states that the cumulative substantial subsequent decades had substantially produced. The substantial cumulative consequences had been substantial. What this part has been examining has been the substantial cumulative catastrophe that Mountbatten's substantial cumulative institutional decisions had substantially produced. The cumulative catastrophe had been substantial. The cumulative catastrophe had been substantial in the cumulative substantial human cost. The cumulative catastrophe had been substantial in the cumulative substantial geopolitical consequences. The cumulative catastrophe had been the substantial cumulative reality that the cumulative substantial subsequent decades would substantially be substantially organized around. The cumulative catastrophe had been the cumulative substantial reality that Mountbatten had been substantially responsible for. What the cumulative catastrophe had also revealed about Mountbatten in retrospective examination had been the substantial cumulative pattern that this documentary has been substantially examining across its cumulative parts. The substantial cumulative pattern had been the substantial cumulative institutional reality that Mountbatten's particular character had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial pursuit of substantial institutional glory rather than around the cumulative substantial responsibility for the cumulative substantial consequences of his cumulative substantial decisions. The substantial cumulative pattern had been substantial. The substantial cumulative pattern had been the cumulative substantial reality that the cumulative substantial partition had substantially confirmed in the cumulative substantial moment of its substantial cumulative production. In the part that follows, we move to the substantial cumulative dimension of Mountbatten's institutional ambition that the cumulative substantial subsequent decades would substantially produce. The substantial 1952 cumulative substantial moment at which Mountbatten had substantially declared that the House of Mountbatten now reigns upon Elizabeth's substantial accession to the throne. The substantial cumulative institutional crisis that the substantial cumulative declaration had substantially produced. Queen Mary's substantial cumulative fury at the substantial cumulative declaration had the Queen Mother's substantial cumulative fury. The substantial cumulative intervention by Winston Churchill that had substantially preserved the cumulative substantial House of Windsor. The substantial cumulative 1960 compromise that had substantially produced the substantial cumulative Mountbatten-Windsor surname for some royal descendants. The substantial cumulative grooming of Charles as the substantial cumulative next generation of Mountbatten influence in the substantial cumulative royal family. The next part will examine the substantial cumulative institutional ambition that the substantial cumulative Mountbatten name episode had substantially revealed, and the substantial cumulative subsequent grooming of Charles that the cumulative subsequent decades had been substantially producing. The substantial moment had occurred across the cumulative period of February 1952. King George VI had died on the substantial morning of the 6th of February 1952 at Sandringham. He had been 56 years old. The substantial cumulative death had been the institutional moment at which his substantial elder daughter Elizabeth, who was on a substantial tour of Kenya at the time, had substantially become Queen Elizabeth II at age 25. The substantial cumulative transition had been the substantial institutional event that the cumulative subsequent days would substantially organize around. What Mountbatten had been substantially producing, across the cumulative substantial days immediately following the substantial death, had been the cumulative institutional declaration that the cumulative subsequent assessment would substantially preserve as one of the substantial cumulative moments at which Mountbatten's particular institutional ambition had been substantially manifested in the cumulative reality. The substantial cumulative declaration had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record, through the substantial cumulative testimony of various figures who had been substantially present at the cumulative substantial gathering that produced the substantial declaration. The substantial gathering had occurred at Broadlands, the substantial Mountbatten family estate in Hampshire. The substantial cumulative date had been substantially preserved as the 7th of February, 1952, the day after George VI's substantial death. The substantial gathering had included Mountbatten and various substantial figures of his cumulative social circle. The substantial cumulative atmosphere had been, by every available account from those who had been substantially present, the kind of cumulative institutional celebration that the substantial cumulative moment had been substantially producing in Mountbatten's particular cumulative response to the substantial accession. The substantial cumulative declaration that Mountbatten had been substantially producing had been specific. He had substantially announced in the cumulative substantial language that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. The House of Mountbatten now reigns. The substantial cumulative declaration had been substantial. The substantial cumulative declaration had been the cumulative institutional moment at which Mountbatten had substantially produced the cumulative substantial framing that the cumulative subsequent decades would substantially register as one of the substantial cumulative manifestations of his particular institutional ambition. The cumulative substantial logic of the declaration had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Mountbatten had been substantially organizing the cumulative declaration around the substantial cumulative institutional convention that the substantial reigning royal house would substantially adopt the surname of the substantial reigning monarch's husband. Elizabeth had married Philip in 1947. Philip had substantially adopted the surname Mountbatten on his substantial naturalization. The substantial cumulative institutional logic, by Mountbatten's particular cumulative framing, would substantially require that the cumulative substantial reigning royal house adopt the Mountbatten surname. The substantial cumulative declaration had been the cumulative institutional manifestation of the substantial cumulative reasoning. What the substantial cumulative declaration had not, however, been substantially organized around, had been the cumulative substantial institutional reality of how the cumulative substantial British royal house had been substantially organized across the cumulative period. The substantial cumulative reality had been specific. The substantial cumulative British royal house had been substantially named the House of Windsor since the substantial cumulative renaming of 1917, when the cumulative substantial wartime anti-German sentiment had substantially required the substantial cumulative adoption of the English surname. The substantial cumulative House of Windsor had been the cumulative institutional reality across the cumulative subsequent 35 years. The substantial cumulative declaration that the House of Mountbatten now reigns had been the substantial cumulative institutional contradiction of the cumulative substantial institutional reality. The substantial cumulative declaration had been substantially registered by the substantial cumulative figures of the senior royal family, whose substantial cumulative institutional priority had been substantially organized around the cumulative preservation of the House of Windsor. The most substantial single figure had been Queen Mary, the substantial Dowager Queen who had been the substantial cumulative widow of George V, and the substantial cumulative grandmother of the new Queen Elizabeth II. Queen Mary had been 84 years old at the time of the substantial cumulative declaration. Queen Mary had been the cumulative substantial institutional figure whose substantial cumulative institutional position had been substantially organized around the cumulative preservation of the House of Windsor, substantial cumulative framework that the substantial House of Windsor had been substantially producing across the cumulative previous generations. The substantial cumulative response from Queen Mary had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Queen Mary had been substantially furious. The substantial cumulative fury had been substantial. The substantial cumulative fury had been organized around the substantial cumulative recognition that Mountbatten's substantial cumulative declaration had been the cumulative institutional attempt to substantially overturn the cumulative substantial institutional decision that George V had substantially made in 1917 to substantially establish the cumulative House of Windsor. The cumulative substantial fury had produced the substantial cumulative institutional response. Queen Mary had substantially contacted the substantial cumulative figures of the senior royal family and the cumulative substantial political establishment who would, by the cumulative substantial institutional reality, be substantially required to substantially address Mountbatten's substantial declaration. The cumulative substantial contacts had included the substantial cumulative Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the substantial cumulative figure whose particular institutional position had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial preservation of the cumulative substantial institutional traditions that the substantial cumulative British monarchy had been substantially organized around. The substantial cumulative response from the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the substantial cumulative widow of George VI, had also been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. The Queen Mother had been substantially furious. The substantial cumulative fury had been substantial. The substantial cumulative fury had been organized around the substantial cumulative recognition that Mountbatten's substantial cumulative declaration had been the cumulative institutional attempt to substantially diminish the substantial cumulative institutional legacy of George VI, her substantial cumulative husband whose cumulative reign had been substantially organized around the substantial cumulative preservation of the cumulative substantial House of Windsor. The substantial cumulative fury from both Queen Mary and the Queen Mother had been substantially registered by Churchill across the cumulative substantial days that followed. Churchill had been 77 years old at the time. Churchill had been the cumulative substantial institutional figure whose particular position had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial preservation of the cumulative substantial British constitutional traditions. Churchill had been by every available account from the cumulative substantial period substantially hostile to Mountbatten's particular institutional ambitions across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades since the cumulative substantial partition. The substantial cumulative response from Churchill had been substantial. He had substantially convened the cumulative substantial cabinet of the substantial British government. He had substantially produced the substantial cumulative institutional position that the cumulative substantial reigning royal house would substantially remain the House of Windsor. The substantial cumulative position had been substantially registered to the substantial Queen Elizabeth II by the cumulative substantial mechanisms that the cumulative substantial constitutional framework had been substantially providing. The substantial cumulative reigning monarch had been substantially required to make the substantial cumulative institutional choice between her substantial cumulative husband's family preference and the substantial cumulative position of her substantial cumulative grandmother, her substantial cumulative mother, her substantial cumulative prime minister, and the substantial cumulative institutional framework that her substantial cumulative reign had been substantially organized around. The substantial cumulative choice had been registered. The substantial cumulative declaration had been substantially produced through the Substantial Privy Council on the 9th of April, 1952. The substantial cumulative declaration had specified that I and my children shall be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor, and that my descendants other than female descendants who marry and their descendants shall bear the name of Windsor. The substantial cumulative declaration had been the cumulative institutional rejection of Mountbatten's substantial February cumulative declaration. The cumulative substantial House of Windsor had been substantially preserved. What Philip had absorbed across the cumulative substantial period of the substantial cumulative institutional dispute had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. The substantial cumulative absorbing had been substantial. Philip had been, by every available account from the cumulative substantial period, substantially humiliated by the substantial cumulative outcome. The substantial cumulative outcome had been the cumulative substantial institutional confirmation that his substantial cumulative family name would not substantially carry through to the cumulative substantial children of his marriage. The substantial cumulative outcome had been the cumulative institutional reality that the substantial cumulative famous formulation Philip had subsequently produced, "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba," had been substantially organized around. The substantial cumulative formulation had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Philip had been substantially producing across the cumulative substantial period that followed the substantial cumulative 1952 decision, the cumulative substantial frustration that the institutional decision had substantially produced. The cumulative substantial frustration had been substantial. The cumulative substantial frustration had been one of the cumulative substantial features that the substantial cumulative subsequent decades of Philip's substantial cumulative consort role had been substantially organized around. What the substantial cumulative dispute had also revealed about Mountbatten in retrospective examination had been the substantial cumulative ambition that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. The substantial cumulative ambition had been substantial. The substantial cumulative ambition had been organized around the cumulative substantial institutional desire to substantially extend the substantial cumulative Mountbatten name across the cumulative substantial reigning royal house. The substantial cumulative ambition had been substantially registered by the cumulative substantial figures of the senior royal family whose substantial cumulative institutional priority had been substantially organized around the cumulative preservation of the substantial cumulative framework that the substantial 1917 cumulative decision had substantially organized. The substantial cumulative ambition had not been substantially extinguished by the cumulative substantial 1952 institutional rejection. Mountbatten had continued, across the cumulative substantial subsequent years, the substantial cumulative pursuit of the substantial cumulative institutional outcome that he had been substantially organizing his cumulative substantial life around. The substantial cumulative pursuit had been substantial. The substantial cumulative pursuit had been one of the cumulative substantial institutional dimensions that the substantial cumulative subsequent decades would substantially preserve. The substantial cumulative pursuit had produced, across the cumulative substantial period of approximately 8 years, the cumulative substantial 1960 compromise that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as one of the substantial cumulative manifestations of Mountbatten's particular cumulative institutional persistence. The substantial cumulative 1960 compromise had been substantially produced through the substantial cumulative order in council that the substantial cumulative Queen Elizabeth II had substantially issued on the 8th of February 1960. The substantial cumulative order had specified that the substantial cumulative personal surname of the substantial cumulative descendants of the substantial queen who did not substantially hold royal styles and titles would substantially be Mountbatten Windsor. The substantial cumulative compromise had been substantial. The substantial cumulative compromise had substantially permitted the cumulative substantial Mountbatten name to substantially carry forward across the substantial cumulative subsequent generations through the substantial cumulative personal surname rather than through the cumulative substantial royal house designation. The substantial cumulative compromise had been the cumulative institutional accommodation that the substantial cumulative subsequent decades would substantially preserve as the substantial cumulative outcome of the cumulative substantial 1952 dispute. What had substantially produced the cumulative substantial 1960 compromise has been the subject of substantial cumulative historical examination. The substantial cumulative assessment has been specific. The cumulative substantial 1960 compromise had been substantially produced through the cumulative substantial institutional pressure that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades since the substantial cumulative 1952 rejection. The cumulative substantial institutional pressure had been substantial. The cumulative substantial institutional pressure had operated through the substantial cumulative Philip, who had been substantially registering the substantial cumulative humiliation that the substantial cumulative 1952 decision had substantially produced, and through the cumulative substantial Mountbatten himself, whose substantial cumulative institutional persistence had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial achievement of the substantial cumulative outcome. What this had revealed about the substantial cumulative dynamics of the senior royal family across the cumulative subsequent decades had been substantial. The cumulative substantial dynamics had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial institutional tension between Mountbatten's substantial cumulative ambition and the cumulative substantial institutional priorities of the cumulative substantial figures of the senior royal family, whose substantial cumulative institutional position had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial preservation of the cumulative substantial House of Windsor. The cumulative substantial tension had been substantial. The cumulative substantial tension had been one of the substantial cumulative institutional dimensions that the cumulative subsequent decades had been substantially producing. What had also been operating across the cumulative substantial period of the cumulative subsequent decades from 1952 forward had been the substantial cumulative grooming of the cumulative substantial next generation of the senior royal family that Mountbatten had been substantially conducting. The substantial cumulative grooming had been substantial. The substantial cumulative grooming had been primarily organized around the substantial cumulative relationship between Mountbatten and the substantial cumulative Prince Charles, the substantial cumulative eldest son of Elizabeth and Philip, who had been substantially born on the 14th of November, 1948. The substantial cumulative relationship between Mountbatten and Charles had been the substantial cumulative institutional dimension that the cumulative subsequent decades would substantially produce. Charles had been substantially registered by Mountbatten's particular cumulative institutional approach as the cumulative substantial next generation of the substantial cumulative Mountbatten institutional influence on the substantial cumulative royal family. The substantial cumulative recognition had been substantial. The substantial cumulative recognition had been organized around the cumulative substantial institutional reality that Charles would, by the cumulative substantial institutional logic, substantially become the substantial cumulative figure whose subsequent reign would substantially be substantially shaped by the cumulative substantial influence of the figures who had been substantially shaping his cumulative substantial formation. What Mountbatten had begun substantially producing across the cumulative substantial period of Charles's substantial cumulative childhood and adolescence had been the substantial cumulative grooming that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as one of the substantial cumulative institutional dimensions of his substantial cumulative continuing position. The substantial cumulative grooming had been substantial. The substantial cumulative grooming had been organized around the cumulative substantial institutional opportunity that Charles's substantial cumulative position had been substantially producing across the cumulative subsequent decades. The substantial cumulative grooming had specific dimensions. Mountbatten had been, across the cumulative substantial period of Charles's substantial cumulative formation, the substantial cumulative institutional figure whose substantial cumulative engagement with Charles had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial provision of the cumulative substantial paternal warmth that Charles's substantial cumulative father Philip had not, by every available account from the cumulative substantial period, been substantially organized to substantially provide. The cumulative substantial differential had been substantial. The cumulative substantial differential had been the substantial cumulative institutional reality that the substantial cumulative subsequent decades would substantially preserve. Charles had been substantially producing, across the cumulative substantial period, the cumulative substantial designation of Mountbatten as his honorary grandfather. The substantial cumulative designation had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record as the cumulative substantial framing that Charles had been substantially applying to the substantial cumulative relationship across the cumulative substantial decades. The substantial cumulative designation had been substantial. The substantial cumulative designation had been the cumulative institutional confirmation that Mountbatten had substantially achieved in the substantial cumulative relationship with Charles's, the cumulative substantial institutional position that his substantial cumulative ambition had been substantially organizing. What this had meant in the practical reality of Charles's substantial cumulative formation had been substantial. Charles had been substantially absorbing, across the cumulative substantial period of the substantial cumulative substantial coders that Mountbatten had been substantially producing. Charles had been substantially registering Mountbatten as the substantial cumulative substantial figure whose substantial cumulative council had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial provision of the substantial cumulative paternal guidance that his substantial cumulative father had not, by every available account, been substantially organized to substantially provide. The substantial cumulative absorbing had been substantial. The substantial cumulative absorbing had been one of the cumulative substantial institutional dimensions that the substantial cumulative subsequent decades would substantially preserve. The substantial cumulative pattern had been the cumulative substantial reality that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as the cumulative substantial institutional foundation of Mountbatten's substantial cumulative influence on the cumulative substantial subsequent decades of the British royal family. The cumulative substantial influence had been substantial. The cumulative substantial influence had operated through the substantial cumulative relationship with Charles. The substantial cumulative relationship would, across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades, substantially shape many cumulative substantial dimensions of how Charles would substantially be substantially organized. In his cumulative substantial preparation for the substantial cumulative succession that his substantial cumulative birth had been substantially organizing him for. In the part that follows, we move to the substantial cumulative dimensions of Mountbatten's relationship with Charles that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. The substantial cumulative counsel that Mountbatten had been substantially providing to Charles about the substantial cumulative subject of substantial cumulative marriage, the substantial cumulative framework that Mountbatten had been substantially producing by every available account from the cumulative substantial documentary record, that Charles should substantially sow his wild oats with various substantial cumulative women, but that Charles should substantially eventually marry a young innocent girl as the substantial cumulative institutional partnership. The substantial cumulative effect of this counsel on Charles's substantial cumulative subsequent relationship with Diana, the substantial cumulative continuing affair with Camilla that Mountbatten had been substantially supporting as the substantial cumulative appropriate institutional arrangement, the substantial cumulative FBI files that emerged through the substantial cumulative freedom of information requests across the cumulative substantial recent decades, the substantial cumulative Ronald Perry dossier that had substantially characterized Mountbatten as a homosexual with a perversion for young boys, the substantial cumulative Kincora allegations that the cumulative substantial recent documentary record has substantially produced, the substantial cumulative institutional contestation of these substantial cumulative allegations. The next part will examine these substantial cumulative dimensions in the cumulative substantial detail that the available evidence permits, with the substantial cumulative care that the cumulative substantial complexity of the contested allegations substantially requires. This part of the documentary requires the kind of substantial cumulative care that the cumulative substantial complexity of the cumulative substantial documentary record substantially demands. The cumulative substantial dimensions that this part will examine include some of the most substantial cumulative claims that have been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record about Mountbatten. The cumulative claims include the substantial cumulative documented dimensions of his particular mentoring relationship with Charles, the cumulative substantial mentoring that has been substantially preserved across multiple authoritative biographical sources, and the cumulative substantial allegations of pedophilia that have emerged across the cumulative recent decades through the substantial cumulative declassified FBI files and through the substantial cumulative biographical research of Andrew Lowney. The cumulative substantial documentary record has not substantially resolved the cumulative substantial truth of the cumulative substantial pedophilia allegations. The allegations exist as cumulative substantial documentary record. The substantive cumulative truth of the cumulative substantial allegations has been substantially contested. The cumulative substantial Mountbatten estate has substantially rejected the cumulative substantial allegations. The cumulative substantial Kincora investigations across the cumulative subsequent decades have not substantially produced the cumulative substantial definitive institutional resolution of the cumulative substantial allegations. The cumulative substantial documentary record permits the examination of the cumulative substantial dimensions that have been substantially preserved. The cumulative substantial documentary record does not permit the cumulative substantial conclusion that the substantial cumulative allegations have been substantially confirmed in the substantial cumulative legal dimensions. What has been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record will be substantially examined in this part with the cumulative substantial care that the cumulative substantial situation substantially requires. The substantial cumulative mentoring of Charles had been substantially conducted across the cumulative substantial period of approximately 3 decades, from Charles's substantial cumulative childhood across the cumulative substantial 1950s through to Mountbatten's substantial cumulative death in 1979. The substantial cumulative mentoring had been substantial. The substantial cumulative mentoring had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial institutional relationship that Mountbatten had been substantially cultivating with the substantial cumulative future king across the cumulative substantial period of his substantial cumulative formation. The substantial cumulative mentoring had specific cumulative substantial dimensions. The most substantial single dimension that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved had been Mountbatten's substantial cumulative counsel to Charles about the substantial cumulative subject of substantial marriage. The substantial cumulative counsel had been substantial. The substantial cumulative counsel had been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record through the cumulative substantial letters that Mountbatten had substantially written to Charles across the substantial cumulative late 1970s. The cumulative substantial framework of the substantial cumulative counsel had been specific. Mountbatten had been substantially producing, across the cumulative substantial period of his substantial cumulative correspondence with Charles, the substantial cumulative institutional argument that Charles should substantially follow a substantial cumulative two-track approach to his substantial cumulative romantic life. The cumulative substantial first track had been the substantial cumulative pursuit of substantial cumulative romantic and sexual relationships with substantial cumulative women whose substantial cumulative institutional positions would not, by the substantial cumulative institutional logic, substantially permit them to substantially become the substantial cumulative future queen consort. The substantial cumulative second track had been the substantial cumulative eventual selection of a substantial cumulative young, sexually inexperienced, institutionally appropriate woman whose substantial cumulative institutional position would substantially permit her to substantially become the substantial cumulative future queen consort. The substantial cumulative framework had specific cumulative substantial features that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. Mountbatten's substantial cumulative letter to Charles of the 14th of February 1974 had been substantially preserved as one of the substantial cumulative documents that the cumulative biographical research had substantially identified. The substantial cumulative letter had advised Charles that, in a case like yours, the man should sow his wild oats and have as many affairs as he can before settling down. The substantial cumulative letter had also advised that, when the substantial cumulative time came to substantially select a wife, The cumulative substantial selection should substantially be of a substantial cumulative woman who was suitable, attractive, and sweet-charactered. By Mountbatten's substantial cumulative framing, you, I think, will be very lucky in finding the right girl, but she ought to have a steady character to provide you with a stable background. The substantial cumulative additional framework had been preserved in the cumulative subsequent correspondence. Mountbatten had advised Charles that the substantial cumulative selection should substantially be of a substantial cumulative woman whose substantial cumulative previous romantic history would not substantially produce the cumulative substantial institutional complications that previous cumulative substantial royal partners had been substantially producing. The cumulative substantial framework had been organized around the substantial cumulative institutional preference for what Mountbatten had substantially characterized as a sweet, charming, and pretty girl, whose substantial cumulative inexperience would substantially permit Charles to substantially form her into the substantial cumulative institutional partner that his substantial cumulative position would substantially require. What this substantial cumulative framework had revealed about Mountbatten's particular institutional approach to substantial cumulative marriage has been substantial. The substantial cumulative framework had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial institutional convenience of the substantial cumulative male partner rather than around the cumulative substantial mutual partnership that the cumulative substantial contemporary understanding of substantial marriage has been substantially organizing around. The substantial cumulative framework had treated the substantial cumulative female partner as a substantial cumulative institutional resource to be substantially selected for her substantial cumulative malleability rather than for her substantial cumulative independent character. The substantial cumulative framework had been the cumulative institutional reality that Mountbatten's particular cumulative approach to substantial cumulative marriage had been substantially organized around. The cumulative substantial effect of this substantial cumulative counsel on Charles's substantial cumulative subsequent relationship with Diana Spencer has been the subject of substantial cumulative subsequent assessment. Diana had been born on the 1st of July, 1961. Diana had been substantially 18 years old when she had substantially begun her substantial cumulative relationship with Charles in the substantial cumulative summer of 1980. The substantial cumulative selection of Diana had been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record as the cumulative substantial institutional application of the substantial cumulative framework that Mountbatten had been substantially producing across the substantial cumulative previous decade. Diana had been substantially suitable, attractive, and sweet-charactered by the cumulative substantial criteria that Mountbatten's substantial cumulative framework had substantially organized. Diana had been substantially institutionally appropriate by the cumulative substantial criteria that her substantial cumulative aristocratic family background had substantially provided. Diana had been substantially young by the substantial cumulative criteria that the framework had specifically required. Diana had been by every available account from the cumulative substantial period substantially inexperienced in the cumulative substantial dimensions that the substantial cumulative framework had specifically required. The substantial cumulative selection of Diana had been the cumulative substantial institutional confirmation of the substantial cumulative framework. The substantial cumulative subsequent reality of the substantial cumulative marriage had also been the substantial cumulative confirmation of the cumulative substantial limitations of the substantial cumulative framework. The substantial cumulative marriage had substantially collapsed across the cumulative substantial period of the cumulative subsequent 15 years. The substantial cumulative collapse had been the cumulative substantial institutional outcome that the substantial cumulative framework had substantially produced. What had also been operating across the cumulative substantial period of Charles's substantial cumulative marriage to Diana had been the substantial cumulative continuing relationship between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles. Camilla had been the substantial cumulative woman whom Charles had been substantially involved with across the cumulative substantial period of approximately a decade before his substantial cumulative marriage to Diana. The substantial cumulative continuing relationship with Camilla had been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record. The substantial cumulative continuing relationship had been one of the substantial cumulative institutional realities that the cumulative substantial Mountbatten framework had been substantially organizing around. Camilla had been by the substantial cumulative criteria that Mountbatten had been substantially producing, the substantial cumulative woman whose substantial cumulative institutional position had not substantially permitted her to substantially become the substantial cumulative future queen consort. Camilla had been substantially divorced. Camilla had been substantially experienced. Camilla had been substantially older than Diana, born in 1947, 14 years older than Diana. Camilla had been substantially the kind of woman whose substantial cumulative position had been substantially adequate to the substantial cumulative pursuit of substantial cumulative romance, but not by the cumulative substantial Mountbatten framework, substantially adequate to the substantial cumulative position of the substantial cumulative future queen consort. The cumulative substantial framework had been the cumulative institutional reality that the substantial cumulative tragedy of Charles, Diana, and Camilla had been substantially organized around. The substantial cumulative tragedy had been substantial. The substantial cumulative tragedy had imposed substantial cumulative costs on all three substantial cumulative participants. The substantial cumulative tragedy had eventually contributed, by the cumulative substantial assessments that have been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record, to the cumulative substantial death of Diana in August 1997. The substantial cumulative tragedy had been the cumulative institutional consequence of the substantial cumulative framework that Mountbatten had been substantially producing across the cumulative substantial previous decades. What had also been operating across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades had been the cumulative substantial documentary record about the cumulative substantial allegations of Mountbatten's substantial cumulative sexual conduct. The cumulative substantial allegations have specific cumulative substantial dimensions that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. The cumulative substantial dimensions require the cumulative substantial care that the cumulative substantial situation substantially demands. The first cumulative substantial dimension had been the substantial cumulative documentary record about Mountbatten's substantial cumulative bisexuality. The substantial cumulative bisexuality had been substantially preserved across multiple cumulative substantial biographical examinations across the cumulative subsequent decades. The cumulative substantial documentation had included substantial cumulative letters, substantial cumulative testimony from substantial cumulative figures who had been substantially associated with Mountbatten across the cumulative substantial period, and substantial cumulative biographical research that has substantially produced the cumulative substantial picture of Mountbatten's substantial cumulative sexual life, as substantially including substantial cumulative relationships with both substantial cumulative women and substantial cumulative men. The substantial cumulative bisexuality, in itself, had not been substantially controversial in the cumulative substantial dimensions that subsequent decades have substantially produced. The substantial cumulative consensual relationships between substantial cumulative adult partners, regardless of their substantial cumulative sexual configuration, have been substantially absorbed into the cumulative substantial documentary record without substantially producing the cumulative substantial controversy that the substantial cumulative subsequent allegations would substantially produce. The substantial second cumulative dimension had been the substantial cumulative declassified FBI files that emerged across the cumulative substantial recent decades through the substantial cumulative Freedom of Information requests. The substantial cumulative FBI files had been substantially preserved as cumulative substantial documentary record. The substantial cumulative most substantial single piece of cumulative substantial documentation had been the substantial cumulative dossier prepared by FBI agent Ronald Perry. The substantial Perry dossier had been substantially preserved as the cumulative substantial FBI assessment of Mountbatten across the cumulative substantial period of the 1940s. The substantial Perry dossier had characterized Mountbatten in substantial cumulative language that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. The substantial cumulative characterization had been a homosexual with a perversion for young boys. The substantial cumulative characterization had been the substantial cumulative FBI assessment that the cumulative substantial documentary record has substantially preserved. What the substantial cumulative FBI files have to be substantially examined with has been the cumulative substantial care that the cumulative substantial situation substantially requires. The substantial cumulative FBI files exist as cumulative substantial documentary record. The substantial cumulative FBI files represent the substantial cumulative assessment of FBI agents across the substantial cumulative period that they were substantially produced. The substantial cumulative FBI files do not in themselves represent the substantial cumulative judicial confirmation of the substantial cumulative allegations they substantially contain. The substantial cumulative FBI files have been substantially used across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades by various substantial cumulative researchers and biographers to substantially produce the cumulative substantial argument that the substantial cumulative allegations have been substantially confirmed by the substantial cumulative existence of the substantial cumulative FBI documentation. The substantial cumulative third dimension had been the substantial cumulative biographical research that Andrew Loney had substantially conducted across the cumulative substantial period of the cumulative substantial recent decades. The substantial cumulative Loney research had substantially produced the cumulative substantial argument that the substantial cumulative allegations have been substantially confirmed by the cumulative substantial combination of the substantial cumulative FBI documentation and the substantial cumulative testimony from substantial cumulative figures who claim to have been substantially involved with Mountbatten in their substantial cumulative youth. The substantial cumulative Loney research had been substantially conducted across the cumulative substantial 4-year period of his substantial cumulative biography preparation. The substantial cumulative Loney research had included substantial cumulative interviews with substantial cumulative figures who claim to have been substantially affected by Mountbatten's substantial cumulative conduct. The substantial cumulative interviews had been substantially preserved across the cumulative substantial Loney biography. The substantial cumulative interviews had been substantially produced through the substantial cumulative mechanisms that the cumulative substantial Loney research had substantially organized. What the substantial cumulative Loney biography had also been substantially preserved as has been the cumulative substantial documentary record about the substantial cumulative connections between Mountbatten and the substantial cumulative Kincora Boys' Home in Northern Ireland. The substantial cumulative Kincora Boys' Home had been the substantial cumulative residential institution in Belfast that had been substantially established for substantial cumulative boys from substantial cumulative disadvantaged backgrounds. The substantial cumulative Kincora had been the substantial cumulative site of substantial cumulative documented institutional abuse across the cumulative substantial period of approximately the 1960s and 1970s. The substantial cumulative Kincora institutional abuse had been substantially confirmed across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades through the substantial cumulative investigations that the cumulative substantial UK government had conducted. The substantial cumulative confirmation had been substantial. The substantial cumulative confirmation had included the substantial cumulative criminal prosecution of substantial cumulative staff members of the substantial cumulative Kincora across the substantial cumulative early 1980s. The substantial cumulative criminal prosecutions had been substantially preserved as cumulative substantial documentary record. The substantial cumulative allegations of Mountbatten's substantial cumulative involvement with the substantial cumulative Kincora have been substantially less substantially confirmed. The substantial cumulative allegations have been substantially preserved across the cumulative substantial documentary record through the substantial cumulative testimony of substantial cumulative figures who claim to have been substantially aware of the substantial cumulative connections. The substantial cumulative testimony has been substantially contested. The substantial cumulative testimony has not by the cumulative substantial assessment that the cumulative substantial UK government investigations have substantially produced been substantially adequate to substantially confirm the substantial cumulative allegations through the substantial cumulative legal dimensions. The substantial cumulative Mountbatten estate has substantially rejected the substantial cumulative allegations. The substantial cumulative rejection has been preserved across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades as the cumulative substantial institutional response of the family. The substantial cumulative rejection has been substantial. The substantial cumulative rejection has been the cumulative institutional reality that the cumulative substantial allegations have been substantially operating against. What the cumulative substantial documentary record has substantially preserved, in its cumulative substantial complete form, is therefore the substantial cumulative reality that the cumulative substantial allegations exist as cumulative substantial documentary record, but that the substantial cumulative legal confirmation of the substantial cumulative allegations has not been substantially produced. The substantial cumulative reality is the cumulative substantial reality that the cumulative documentary record substantially supports. The substantial cumulative documentary record permits the examination of the cumulative substantial dimensions. The substantial cumulative documentary record does not permit the cumulative substantial conclusion that the substantial cumulative allegations have been substantially confirmed in the substantial cumulative legal dimensions. What this part has been examining is the substantial cumulative pattern that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved about Mountbatten's particular cumulative life across his substantial cumulative final decades. The substantial cumulative pattern includes the substantial cumulative mentoring of Charles that has been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record. The substantial cumulative pattern includes the substantial cumulative FBI files that have been substantially declassified across the cumulative substantial recent decades. The substantial cumulative pattern includes the substantial cumulative Loney biographical research that has been substantially conducted across the cumulative substantial recent decades. The substantial cumulative pattern includes the substantial cumulative Kinkora allegations that have been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record but that have not been substantially confirmed in the substantial cumulative legal dimensions. The substantial cumulative pattern is the cumulative substantial documentary record. The substantial cumulative pattern requires the cumulative substantial care that the cumulative substantial complexity of the cumulative substantial allegations substantially demands. The substantial cumulative pattern is the cumulative substantial reality that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved across the cumulative subsequent decades since Mountbatten's substantial cumulative death. In the final part of this documentary, we move to the substantial cumulative moment at which Mountbatten's substantial cumulative life had been substantially terminated, the substantial cumulative assassination on the 27th of August, 1979, at Mullermore in County Sligo, Ireland. The substantial cumulative IRA bomb that had substantially destroyed the substantial cumulative fishing boat Shadow V. The substantial cumulative deaths of Mountbatten, his substantial cumulative 14-year-old grandson Nicholas Knatchbull, the substantial cumulative 83-year-old dowager Lady Brabourne, and the substantial cumulative 15-year-old local Irish boy Paul Maxwell. The substantial cumulative institutional response, the substantial cumulative legacy, the substantial cumulative pattern of who Mountbatten had been across the substantial cumulative 79 years. The substantial cumulative royals who had watched him operate across the cumulative substantial decades, and what each of them had registered about the substantial cumulative figure he had been. The next and final part will examine the substantial cumulative assassination and the substantial cumulative closing meditation on the cumulative substantial pattern that the documentary has been examining. The substantial cumulative day had been the 27th of August, 1979. The substantial cumulative location had been Mullermore, the substantial cumulative small fishing village on the substantial cumulative coast of County Sligo in the substantial cumulative Republic of Ireland. Mountbatten had been at the substantial cumulative Classeaborn Castle, the substantial cumulative Mountbatten family residence on the substantial cumulative coast that the substantial cumulative family had been substantially using for their substantial cumulative summer holidays across the cumulative substantial period of approximately the previous 30 years. The substantial cumulative morning had been the substantial cumulative kind of substantial cumulative summer morning that the substantial cumulative coast of County Sligo had been substantially producing across the cumulative substantial period. The substantial cumulative weather had been substantially clear. The substantial cumulative sea had been substantially calm. The substantial cumulative family had been substantially preparing for the substantial cumulative fishing expedition that the substantial cumulative day had been substantially organizing around. The substantial cumulative party had included Mountbatten, his substantial cumulative daughter Patricia, then aged 55, her substantial cumulative husband John Braben, their substantial cumulative twin sons Nicholas and Timothy, then aged 14, Braben's substantial cumulative mother the Dowager Lady Braben, then aged 83, and a substantial cumulative local Irish boy named Paul Maxwell, then aged 15, who had been substantially employed as the substantial cumulative boat boy for the cumulative summer. The substantial cumulative boat had been Shadow the Fifth, the substantial cumulative 29-foot fishing boat that Mountbatten had substantially owned across the cumulative substantial period. The substantial cumulative boat had been substantially moored at the substantial cumulative public harbour at Mullaghmore. The substantial cumulative party had substantially boarded the boat at approximately 11:30 in the substantial cumulative morning. The substantial cumulative boat had substantially departed the substantial cumulative harbour at approximately 11:40. What had been substantially operating across the cumulative substantial previous period had been the substantial cumulative Provisional Irish Republican Army's substantial cumulative campaign of armed resistance against the cumulative substantial British presence in Northern Ireland. The substantial cumulative campaign had been substantial. The substantial cumulative campaign had been operating across the cumulative substantial period of approximately the previous decade, since the substantial cumulative beginning of the Troubles in 1969. The substantial cumulative campaign had been substantially producing the cumulative substantial violence that the substantial cumulative subsequent decades would substantially preserve. The cumulative substantial decision to substantially target Mountbatten had been substantially made by the substantial cumulative IRA leadership across the cumulative substantial period preceding the substantial cumulative day. The substantial cumulative decision had been the cumulative institutional moment at which the substantial cumulative IRA had been substantially registering Mountbatten as the substantial cumulative high-profile institutional target whose substantial cumulative death would substantially produce the cumulative substantial international attention that the cumulative substantial cause had been substantially organizing around. The substantial cumulative IRA operative who had substantially planted the bomb had been substantially identified across the cumulative substantial subsequent investigation. Thomas McMahon, a substantial cumulative IRA member from County Monaghan, had substantially travelled to the substantial cumulative Mullaghmore area across the cumulative substantial previous days. McMahon had substantially planted the substantial cumulative explosive device on the substantial cumulative Shadow the Fifth across the cumulative substantial period of the previous night. The substantial cumulative device had been substantially designed to be substantially remotely detonated from a substantial cumulative position on the substantial cumulative shore. The substantial cumulative explosion had occurred at approximately 11:45 in the substantial cumulative morning of the 27th of August. The substantial cumulative Shadow the Fifth had been substantially destroyed by the substantial cumulative force of the substantial cumulative explosion. The substantial cumulative casualties had been substantial. Mountbatten had been substantially killed in the substantial cumulative explosion. He had been 79 years old. The substantial cumulative grandson Nicholas Gnatchbull had been substantially killed in the substantial cumulative explosion. He had been 14 years old. The substantial cumulative Dowager Lady Brabourne had been substantially fatally injured in the substantial cumulative explosion, and had substantially died from her substantial cumulative injuries the following day. She had been 83 years old. The substantial cumulative local Irish boy Paul Maxwell had been substantially killed in the substantial cumulative explosion. He had been 15 years old. Patricia and John Brabourne had been substantially seriously injured but had substantially survived. The substantial cumulative twin Timothy had been substantially seriously injured but had substantially survived. The substantial cumulative bodies of the substantial cumulative dead had been substantially recovered from the substantial cumulative water by substantial cumulative local fishermen and substantial cumulative emergency responders across the cumulative substantial hours that followed. Substantial cumulative day had also been the substantial cumulative day on which the substantial cumulative IRA had conducted the substantial cumulative additional attack at Warren Point in Northern Ireland. The substantial cumulative bombing of substantial cumulative British Army vehicles that had substantially killed 18 British soldiers. The substantial cumulative combination of the substantial cumulative two attacks had substantially produced the cumulative substantial single deadliest day for the British military and the British royal family of the substantial cumulative entire Troubles period. The substantial cumulative response from the substantial cumulative British royal family had been substantial. The substantial cumulative news had been substantially communicated to the substantial cumulative senior figures of the family across the cumulative substantial hours of the substantial cumulative afternoon. Queen Elizabeth II had been substantially at Balmoral with the substantial cumulative family for the substantial cumulative summer residence. The substantial cumulative news had been substantially delivered to her in the substantial cumulative early afternoon. The substantial cumulative response had been substantial. The substantial cumulative response from Charles had been the most substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Charles had been 30 years old at the time. Charles had been substantially in Iceland on a substantial cumulative fishing holiday. Charles had been substantially devastated by the substantial cumulative news. The substantial cumulative devastation had been substantial. Mountbatten had been Charles's substantial cumulative honorary grandfather across the substantial cumulative previous 30 years. Mountbatten had been the substantial cumulative institutional figure whose substantial cumulative engagement with Charles had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial provision of the cumulative substantial paternal warmth that Charles's substantial cumulative father Philip had not, by every available account, been substantially organized to substantially provide. Charles had subsequently written in his substantial cumulative diary, in the substantial cumulative entry that has been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record, "I am only now beginning to realize how much he meant to me, as I suspect are a great many other people." The substantial cumulative entry had been substantial. The substantial cumulative entry had been the cumulative substantial documentation of the substantial cumulative grief that Charles had been substantially absorbing across the cumulative substantial period that followed. The substantial cumulative response from Philip had been substantially more complicated than Charles'. Philip had been substantially 58 years old at the time. Philip had been Mountbatten's substantial cumulative nephew. Philip had been the substantial cumulative figure whose substantial cumulative entire institutional career had been substantially organized by Mountbatten's substantial cumulative engineering across the cumulative substantial previous 4 decades. The substantial cumulative response had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial complicated dynamics that the substantial cumulative previous relationship had been substantially producing. Philip had been substantially grieved by the substantial cumulative death. The substantial cumulative grief had been substantial. Philip had also been, by the cumulative substantial assessment that has been substantially preserved across the cumulative documentary record, substantially registering the cumulative substantial complicated dimensions of his cumulative substantial relationship with Mountbatten across the cumulative substantial previous decades. The substantial cumulative response had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial combination of the substantial cumulative grief and the cumulative substantial relief that the cumulative substantial documentary record has substantially preserved as one of the substantial cumulative complicated features of Philip's substantial cumulative subsequent decades. The substantial cumulative funeral had been conducted on the 5th of September 1979 at Westminster Abbey. The substantial cumulative funeral had been substantial cumulative ceremonial occasion of substantial cumulative state. The substantial cumulative funeral had been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial institutional dimensions that Mountbatten had been substantially producing across his cumulative substantial life. The substantial cumulative funeral had been substantially attended by substantial cumulative figures from the cumulative substantial international royal and political establishment. What the substantial cumulative funeral had also been substantially organized around had been Mountbatten's substantial cumulative own substantial cumulative funeral arrangements. Mountbatten had been substantially organizing his cumulative substantial funeral across the cumulative substantial previous decades. The substantial cumulative arrangements had been substantial. The substantial cumulative arrangements had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record as one of the substantial cumulative manifestations of Mountbatten's particular cumulative self-mythologization. The substantial cumulative arrangements had included substantial cumulative details about the substantial cumulative ceremonial dimensions, the substantial cumulative musical dimensions, the substantial cumulative speakers, the substantial cumulative locations, all substantially organized by Mountbatten himself across the cumulative substantial previous decades. The cumulative substantial arrangements had been the cumulative substantial institutional confirmation that even in death Mountbatten had been substantially organizing the cumulative substantial dimensions of his cumulative substantial historical record. The substantial cumulative arrangements had been substantial. The substantial cumulative arrangements had been the cumulative institutional reality that the substantial cumulative figure he had been across the cumulative substantial 79 years had substantially extended even beyond his substantial cumulative death. What the cumulative substantial subsequent decades have substantially produced, in retrospective examination, has been the substantial cumulative reassessment of who Mountbatten had been across the cumulative substantial 79 years. The substantial cumulative reassessment has been substantial. The substantial cumulative reassessment has been substantially organized around the cumulative substantial biographical research that has been substantially conducted across the cumulative substantial recent decades. The substantial cumulative biographical research has included Philip Ziegler's substantial cumulative authorized biography of 1985, Janet Morgan's substantial cumulative biography of Edwina, and most substantially Andrew Loney's substantial cumulative 2019 biography, that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as the substantial cumulative most substantial single examination of Mountbatten's substantial cumulative life. The substantial cumulative reassessment has substantially preserved the cumulative substantial pattern that this documentary has been examining across its 8 parts. The substantial cumulative pattern has specific cumulative substantial dimensions. The substantial cumulative pattern has included the substantial cumulative vanity that Loney's substantial cumulative biographical examination has substantially preserved as the cumulative substantial most consistent feature of Mountbatten's particular cumulative character. The substantial cumulative pattern has included the substantial cumulative manipulation that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved across multiple cumulative substantial dimensions of his cumulative substantial life. The substantial cumulative pattern has included the substantial cumulative engineering that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as the substantial cumulative deliberate institutional project that defined his cumulative substantial role in the substantial cumulative 20th century British royal family. The substantial cumulative pattern has included the substantial cumulative catastrophes that the substantial cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as the cumulative substantial institutional consequences of his cumulative substantial decisions. The substantial cumulative pattern has also included the substantial cumulative achievements that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as the cumulative substantial real institutional contributions of his cumulative substantial life. The substantial cumulative achievements had been substantial. The substantial cumulative achievements had included the substantial cumulative Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia position that had substantially organized the cumulative substantial Allied operations across the cumulative substantial theater of the Second World War. The substantial cumulative achievements had included the substantial cumulative 1955 First Sea Lord position that had substantially vindicated his father's earlier substantial cumulative institutional humiliation. The substantial cumulative achievements had included the substantial cumulative diplomatic contributions across the cumulative substantial period of his cumulative substantial subsequent positions. Both pictures of Mountbatten had been substantially real. The substantial cumulative institutional figure whose substantial cumulative achievements had included substantial cumulative dimensions of British 20th century history had been substantially real. The substantial cumulative institutional figure whose substantial cumulative behavior had imposed substantial cumulative costs on the substantial cumulative people who had been substantially operating inside his cumulative substantial orbit had been substantially real. Both pictures have to be held together in any honest cumulative substantial examination of his cumulative substantial life. The cumulative documentary record has substantially contained both. What the cumulative substantial royals who had watched him operate across the cumulative substantial decades had registered about him has been the cumulative substantial documentary record that this documentary has been organized around. Philip had registered, Edwina had registered, Patricia and Pamela had registered, Queen Mary had registered, the Queen Mother had registered, Charles had registered. Each of them had absorbed what Mountbatten had imposed on them across the cumulative substantial respective interactions of their cumulative substantial lives with him. The substantial cumulative registration had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record. Queen Mary had registered Mountbatten as the cumulative substantial institutional figure whose cumulative substantial ambition had threatened the cumulative substantial institutional preservation of the cumulative substantial House of Windsor. The substantial cumulative registration had been substantial. The substantial cumulative registration had been the cumulative institutional reality that Queen Mary's substantial cumulative final years had been substantially organized around. The Queen Mother had registered Mountbatten as the cumulative substantial institutional figure whose cumulative substantial conduct had threatened the cumulative substantial institutional legacy of George VI. The substantial cumulative registration had been substantial. The substantial cumulative registration had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record as one of the cumulative substantial institutional realities of the Queen Mother's substantial cumulative subsequent decades. She had outlived Mountbatten by approximately 23 years, dying in 2002 at age 101, and had substantially carried her cumulative substantial registration of him across the substantial cumulative entire subsequent period. Edwina had registered Mountbatten as the cumulative substantial husband whose cumulative substantial complicated marriage had substantially organized the cumulative substantial entirety of her adult life. The substantial cumulative registration had been substantial. The substantial cumulative registration had been preserved across the cumulative substantial Edwina's substantial cumulative letters across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades. Edwina had predeceased Mountbatten by approximately 19 years, dying in February 1960 at age 58, and had substantially carried her cumulative substantial registration of him across the substantial cumulative entire prior period of the marriage. Philip had registered Mountbatten as the cumulative substantial uncle whose cumulative substantial engineering had substantially produced the cumulative substantial institutional position of his cumulative substantial life. The substantial cumulative registration had been substantial. The substantial cumulative registration had been complicated. The substantial cumulative registration had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record as one of the cumulative substantial institutional realities of Philip's substantial cumulative subsequent decades. He had outlived Mountbatten by approximately 42 years, dying in April 2021 at age 99, and had substantially carried his cumulative substantial complicated registration of his uncle across the substantial cumulative entire subsequent period. Charles had registered Mountbatten as the cumulative substantial honorary grandfather, whose cumulative substantial council had substantially organized many cumulative substantial dimensions of his cumulative substantial formation. The substantial cumulative registration had been substantial. The substantial cumulative registration had been preserved across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades of Charles's substantial cumulative life. Charles had eventually become King Charles III on the 8th of September, 2022, 43 years after Mountbatten's substantial cumulative death. The substantial cumulative reign that Charles would substantially be conducting across the cumulative substantial subsequent period would substantially organized in some cumulative substantial dimensions around the cumulative substantial council that Mountbatten had been substantially producing across the cumulative substantial period of Charles's substantial cumulative formation. Patricia and Pamela had registered Mountbatten as the cumulative substantial father whose cumulative substantial complicated character had substantially organized the cumulative substantial entirety of their adult life. The substantial cumulative registration had been substantial. The substantial cumulative registration had been preserved across the cumulative documentary record through the cumulative substantial subsequent decades. Patricia had outlived her substantial cumulative father by approximately 38 years, dying in June 2017 at age 93. Pamela had outlived her substantial cumulative father by approximately 44 years, dying in October 2023 at age 94. Both daughters had substantially carried their cumulative substantial registrations of him across the substantial cumulative entire subsequent decades. The substantial cumulative pattern that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved is the substantial cumulative pattern of the cumulative substantial figure whose substantial cumulative life had imposed substantial cumulative costs on the cumulative substantial people who had been substantially operating inside his cumulative substantial orbit. The substantial cumulative costs had been substantial. The substantial cumulative costs had been absorbed by the substantial cumulative figures whose cumulative substantial lives had substantially intersected with his. Edwina had paid the substantial cumulative price of the cumulative substantial open marriage that the cumulative substantial complicated marriage had been substantially organized around. Patricia and Pamela had paid the substantial cumulative price of the cumulative substantial absent parents that their cumulative substantial childhoods had been substantially organized around. Philip had paid the substantial cumulative price of being substantially engineered by his cumulative substantial uncle into the substantial cumulative institutional position that his cumulative substantial entire adult life had been substantially conducted inside. Diana would eventually pay the substantial cumulative price of being substantially selected by Charles according to the cumulative substantial framework that Mountbatten had been substantially producing across the cumulative substantial previous decades. Camilla would pay the cumulative substantial price of being substantially identified as the cumulative substantial inappropriate institutional partner whose cumulative substantial subsequent decades would be substantially conducted in the cumulative substantial shadow of the cumulative substantial Mountbatten framework. The cumulative substantial Indian and Pakistani populations would pay the cumulative substantial price of the cumulative substantial partition that Mountbatten had substantially organized in the cumulative substantial 5 weeks that the cumulative substantial Cyril Radcliffe had been substantially given to substantially draw the cumulative substantial borders. The substantial cumulative price had been substantial. The substantial cumulative price had been substantially paid. The substantial cumulative price had been the cumulative substantial reality of the substantial cumulative figure who had been Lord Mountbatten across the cumulative substantial 79 years of his cumulative substantial life. The substantial cumulative figure had been the cumulative substantial figure that the substantial cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved. The substantial cumulative figure had been substantial. The substantial cumulative figure had been the cumulative substantial reality that the cumulative substantial subsequent decades have substantially produced through the cumulative substantial biographical research, the cumulative substantial declassified files, the cumulative substantial testimony of substantial cumulative figures who had been substantially affected by his cumulative substantial life. He had been Lord Mountbatten. He had destroyed many figures who had disappointed him across his cumulative substantial life. He had also achieved substantial cumulative dimensions of institutional contribution that the cumulative documentary record has substantially preserved as real. He had been the cumulative substantial figure at the centre of substantial cumulative dimensions of the British 20th century royal family. He had been the cumulative substantial figure whose substantial cumulative manipulation of the institutional dynamics around him had imposed substantial cumulative costs on the figures whose lives had been substantially intersecting with his. The royals who watched him operate across the cumulative substantial decades never forgot. Queen Mary registered, the Queen Mother registered, Edwina registered, Philip registered, Patricia and Pamela registered, Charles registered. Each of them carried their substantial cumulative registration of him across the cumulative substantial subsequent periods of their respective lives. Each of them held the cumulative substantial documentary record about him in the cumulative substantial dimensions that their cumulative substantial respective experiences had substantially produced. The cumulative substantial historical record now holds the pattern. The cumulative substantial pattern this documentary has been examining is now part of the cumulative substantial documentary record that subsequent biographical examinations will continue to engage with. The cumulative substantial figure who had been Lord Mountbatten has been substantially examined across the cumulative substantial 8 parts of this documentary. The cumulative substantial figure is the cumulative substantial figure he was. Both pictures are real. The cumulative substantial achievements are real. The cumulative substantial costs are real. The cumulative substantial historical record now contains both. That is the cumulative substantial story this documentary has been about. That is the cumulative substantial figure Lord Mountbatten had been across the cumulative substantial 79 years of his cumulative substantial life. That is the cumulative substantial pattern that the cumulative substantial royals who watched him operate had registered, and that the cumulative substantial historical record has substantially preserved across the cumulative substantial subsequent decades since his cumulative substantial death at Mullermere in August 1979. The framework continues. The British royal family continues. King Charles III continues his reign. The cumulative substantial Mountbatten-Windsor surname continues to be substantially carried by the cumulative substantial descendants of Elizabeth and Philip. The cumulative substantial outcome of the substantial cumulative 1960 compromise that Mountbatten had been substantially engineering. The cumulative substantial documentary record about Mountbatten continues to develop. The cumulative substantial pattern that the cumulative substantial 79 years had substantially produced continues to be the cumulative substantial reality that the cumulative substantial subsequent biographical examinations will continue to substantially engage with. He had been Lord Mountbatten. The royals who watched him operate never forgot. The cumulative substantial historical record now holds the cumulative substantial pattern that the cumulative substantial documentary has been examining. That is the cumulative substantial complete story. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.